Look, we all have that one specific person in our lives. You know, the absolute rock, the one you immediately call at 2 a.m. when your entire world is falling apart and you just don't know what to do. Or maybe, well, maybe you are that person. You're the strong friend. You are the designated therapist of your friend group, the completely reliable one, the one who somehow always has the exact right advice and a seemingly endless supply of patience. But I really want you to think about something for a second. What actually happens when the pillar holding everything else up starts to crack under the weight? Society, you know, it absolutely glorifies the strong friend. We praise them endlessly. We rely on them heavily, but we rarely, if ever, actually stop to check on them. And I mean, why would we? From the outside looking in, they always seem like they have it completely all together, right? But psychologically speaking, there is a massive, often completely invisible cost to constantly carrying the heavy emotional weight of everyone around you. It's not just being a good listener, it's a very real, very dangerous clinical phenomenon called compassion fatigue. And today, well, I want to talk deeply about what actually happens when the strong friend finally breaks. Now, let's just think about how this dynamic even starts, because it certainly doesn't usually happen overnight. Actually, it often stems from way back in childhood. You know, there's this fascinating concept in family systems theory that points to the parentified child. Basically, these are the kids who grew up having to smooth over all the arguments, mediate the bitter conflicts between their parents, or just silently take care of the chaotic emotional weather in the household. So naturally, they carry this exact same survival mechanism into their adulthood. I mean, it basically becomes their entire core identity. Being needed feels exactly like being loved, and that's a really crucial psychological point to understand. If your subconscious fundamentally believes that your absolute worth as a human being is directly tied to how useful you are to others, well, you're basically setting up a devastating psychological trap for yourself, right? You essentially become this giant emotional sponge, constantly absorbing everyone's grief, their daily stress, their messy breakups, their financial worries, their existential dread. And for a while, it actually works. You feel incredibly purposeful. You feel deeply valued. You feel like you matter because you are the essential glue holding everyone's lives together. But here's the harsh, unavoidable reality about human empathy. It is absolutely not an infinite resource. I think we genuinely like to pretend it is, like it's some magical, bottomless fountain, but it's really not. So, when we look at the cognitive neuroscience behind this, it actually shows us something fascinating and, frankly, a bit terrifying. When we deeply, truly empathize with someone who is hurting, the specific pain matrix in our own brains physically lights up on an fMRI scan. We literally, neurologically feel a shadow of their exact pain. So just imagine doing that every single day. Imagine your brain constantly processing secondhand trauma day in and day out, over coffee, over late-night text messages, over hours-long phone calls. Well, eventually, the nervous system just completely overloads. And that's exactly where we enter the dark, heavy territory of compassion fatigue. Now, people very often confuse this concept with regular, everyday burnout, but they are, in fact, quite profoundly different. Burnout, you know, is mostly about the stress of your specific environment, like working way too many hours, pushing desperately for a deadline, or dealing with a highly toxic boss. It makes you feel overwhelmed, physically exhausted, and cynical about your job. But compassion fatigue, that's so much deeper. It is literally an emotional erosion. It's the profound, bone-deep exhaustion that comes specifically from caring too much for way too long without ever getting anything back to replenish your own spirit. Charles Figley, who is a renowned traumatologist, famously described it as a total state of exhaustion and dysfunction biologically, psychologically, and socially as a direct result of prolonged exposure to compassion stress. It is basically the ultimate cost of caring. I mean, let's be incredibly real for a second here. When you are the strong friend, your friends aren't usually trying to purposely hurt you. They aren't malicious villains in your story. They forget that you're human too, you know? They look at you and they just see this infinite, bottomless well of wisdom and patience. And because you never actually say no, because you never pause and say, hey, I'm actually really struggling today and I can't hold this for you, they just keep pulling and pulling from the well. But what actually happens when the well finally runs bone dry? Well, the break doesn't usually happen with some massive theatrical explosion. You know, it's almost never this dramatic, cinematic breakdown where you're screaming in the pouring rain. Actually, it's usually incredibly quiet. It looks a lot like silent, slow withdrawal. One of the very first things that happens, and this is something so many strong friends feel so deeply guilty and ashamed about, is a psychological phenomenon called emotional blunting. You know what I mean? It's that chilling moment when a friend calls you crying hysterically about the exact same relationship problem for the 100th time, and instead of feeling warmth and deep concern like you usually do, you just feel absolutely nothing, a total numb void. Or worse, you actually feel deeply irritated. You feel incredibly annoyed that they are calling you. And then, like immediately after having that thought, you feel this crushing, suffocating wave of guilt because, well, you're supposed to be the good, caring, unconditionally supportive friend, right? But the absolute truth is, your brain is literally shutting down your empathy receptors as a desperate biological survival mechanism. It's basically screaming, look, we cannot take a single piece of emotional data anymore. We are completely full. We have to shut the gates or we are going to collapse. And this sudden numbness, well, it inevitably spreads. It bleeds into absolutely everything in your life. You start intentionally avoiding phone calls. You leave urgent texts on read for days at a time, which, you know, is completely and totally out of character for you. Right? Because you used to be the person who replied instantly, always ready to jump right into action. But now, even just looking at your glowing phone screen gives you a massive spike of anxiety. You slowly start seeing messages not as genuine human connections, but as exhausting, heavy demands on your already completely depleted energy. Every single "Hey, can we talk?" feels like a literal physical weight being heavily dropped onto your chest. And it's incredibly important to understand that it's not because you suddenly stopped loving your friends. I really want to emphasize that point. It's absolutely not a lack of love. It's a total devastating depletion of emotional energy. And then, inevitably, comes the resentment phase. Oh man, the resentment is incredibly heavy. You know, you start looking around at your closest relationships and you suddenly realize how incredibly one-sided they've actually become over the years. You start keeping this bitter mental tally, like, I literally spent 3 agonizing hours talking them down from a severe panic attack last week, but when I casually mentioned I was feeling overwhelmed yesterday, they just immediately changed the subject back to themselves. And you know, holding on to that dark resentment is toxic, sure, but it's also completely and utterly valid. Because in that quiet moment of reflection, you realize with absolute horror that you've systematically trained everyone around you to only ever see you as a caretaker, as a highly functional tool for their own comfort, and not as a real breathing person who also desperately needs care and a soft place to land. You've basically built a lonely, isolated cage out of your own relentless reliability, and suddenly you are entirely trapped inside it. And we absolutely cannot forget about the severe physical toll all of this takes on the human body. I mean, psychology and physiology are so deeply, intimately connected. Compassion fatigue doesn't just live quietly in your mind, it physically manifests in very real ways. Your body absolutely keeps the score. So, what does that actually look like in real life? Well, it usually looks like chronic, maddening insomnia because your nervous system is permanently stuck in a hypervigilant fight-or-flight state, constantly scanning the horizon for the next big crisis you have to fix. It's unexplained stomach issues, debilitating tension headaches, or just getting sick all the time because the chronic, unending emotional stress has completely decimated your immune system. You wake up feeling totally exhausted, no matter how many hours of sleep you somehow manage to get, because it isn't just your body that's tired, your actual soul is profoundly fatigued. You know, your brain is just constantly running these massive, exhausting background programs, desperately trying to solve complex emotional puzzles that aren't even yours to solve in the first place. You are essentially carrying the heavy neurochemical burden of 5, 10, maybe a dozen other human beings. It's basically exactly like trying to run a brutal marathon while wearing a heavy backpack that everyone you know just keeps casually dropping large rocks into as you run past them. Eventually, no matter how incredibly strong your legs are, no matter how much sheer willpower you have, your knees are absolutely going to buckle. It's not a matter of weakness, it's just pure, unavoidable physics. And when that inevitable collapse finally happens, the resulting silence from the people you spent your entire life holding up is perhaps the most deafening, heartbreaking sound in the entire world. So, when the crash actually finally happens, it is honestly a deeply disorienting experience. I mean, you've spent your whole life holding the compass for everyone else, right? And now, suddenly, you are completely lost in your own woods without a map. And what's really jarring about this exact moment is how the people around you react. You know, you'd think, logically, that because you've given them years of unconditional, unwavering support, they would immediately rush to your side the second you stumble. But, well, psychology teaches us something a little bit darker about human behavior in these specific situations. People are incredibly resistant to change, especially when that change inconveniences them or disrupts a system that heavily benefits them. So, when the strong friend finally breaks and steps back, the immediate reaction from the group isn't usually profound empathy. It's actually, unfortunately, often confusion or even frustration. They might say things like, "Well, you've just changed," or "Why are you being so distant and cold lately?" And I mean, that reaction right there. That is the exact thing that twists the knife deeper because it proves that they didn't actually see your exhaustion. They only saw the sudden absence of the service you were relentlessly providing. And then, naturally, comes the immense, suffocating avalanche of guilt. I really want to talk about this guilt because, honestly, it is the heaviest chain holding the strong friend down. You know, you sit there, isolating in your room, and your brain just starts spinning these awful, self-deprecating narratives. You tell yourself that you are being incredibly selfish. You tell yourself that so-and-so is going through a terrible divorce and your need for a mental health day is like nothing compared to their massive crisis. I mean, we constantly play this twisted game of trauma Olympics in our heads, constantly diminishing our own pain just because someone else's fire looks a little bit brighter. But here is a fundamental psychological truth that you absolutely have to internalize right now. Pain is completely subjective, and your emotional exhaustion is entirely valid regardless of what anyone else is going through. You cannot pour from an empty cup, right? We hear that cliche all the time, but we rarely ever let the reality of it actually sink into our bones. If you are literally running on empty, trying to fix someone else's problems isn't just harmful to you, it's actually doing a massive disservice to them because you are offering them a completely hollow version of your support. So, how do we actually fix this? How does a deeply entrenched, parentified, strong friend begin to heal from severe compassion fatigue without feeling like they are totally abandoning the people they love? Well, it all starts with one of the most terrifying words in the entire English language, especially for people like us: boundaries. I know. The word boundaries is thrown around online a lot these days, basically to the point where it almost feels like meaningless internet therapy jargon. But from a clinical psychological perspective, boundaries are essentially the immune system of your mental health. I mean, think about it like a literal fence around your emotional property. For your entire life, you've basically operated with zero fences. You've just left the front door wide open, and literally anyone could just walk right into your living room at 3 a.m. with their muddy shoes and their emotional baggage, and you just smiled and offered them a warm cup of tea while you quietly cleaned up the mud. Establishing boundaries means finally, bravely building a fence. It means deciding clearly and firmly what you will and absolutely will not allow into your personal emotional space moving forward. And setting these boundaries, honestly, is going to feel incredibly uncomfortable at first. I mean, it is going to feel literally wrong. Your nervous system is so profoundly wired to seek safety through pleasing others that the moment you finally say no, your brain is going to throw a massive alarm, screaming that you are in deep social danger, that everyone is going to hate you and completely abandon you. You know, when a friend texts you yet another major crisis while you are trying to rest, and you reply with something like, "I am so sorry you are going through this, but I actually don't have the emotional capacity to be a good listener for you right now." Your heart is probably going to pound right out of your chest. You'll probably stare at the screen, sweating, just waiting for the inevitable backlash. And the hard truth is, there might actually be some backlash. Like I said earlier, people really don't like it when you suddenly rewrite the unspoken rules of the relationship. Some people might even drift away completely. But, and this is crucial, the people who genuinely get angry at you for setting healthy boundaries are basically just exposing the fact that their respect for you was entirely dependent on your total lack of boundaries. That realization alone can bring an immense wave of grief. I mean, you are fundamentally mourning the idealized version of your friendships. You are mourning the painful realization that you were often valued more for your utility than for your actual humanity. But, well, this messy, painful pruning process is absolutely necessary for your psychological survival. Because as you slowly start trimming away the incredibly draining, one-sided relationships, you are finally creating actual space in your life. Space for rest, space for hobbies that have absolutely nothing to do with helping other people. And, most importantly, space to finally meet yourself. You know, so many strong friends literally do not know who they actually are outside of being a caregiver. If you strip away the title of the reliable one or the unpaid therapist, what is actually left underneath? That can be a terrifying question to face, but it is also a profoundly beautiful opportunity. You finally get to discover what you actually like, what you actually want, and what genuinely brings you deep, personal joy, independent of anyone else's needs or constant validations. Let's talk a little bit about rebuilding a genuine support system because, just because you are stepping back from being everyone's savior doesn't mean you should become completely isolated. In fact, it means the exact opposite. It means you desperately need to learn how to do the one thing you have probably avoided for your entire life: asking for help. I mean, it sounds simple, right? Just ask for help. But for a chronic strong friend, asking for help feels completely unnatural. It feels like an admission of profound failure. It feels incredibly deeply vulnerable. But vulnerability is actually the only bridge to true, authentic connection. When you only ever let people see your strength, you are basically blocking them from truly knowing you. Genuine friendships aren't built on a foundation of one person constantly saving the other. They are built on mutual reciprocity, on a completely balanced give and take. You have to actively practice letting your guard down. Start incredibly small if you have to. Just text a friend and say, "Hey, I had a really awful day at work, and I just feel sad." Don't offer a solution. Don't immediately follow it up with a joke to lighten the mood. Just let the raw, messy truth sit there in the open. And as you slowly do this, over and over again, you will completely retrain your brain. You will learn through repeated, safe experiences that you don't actually have to be invincible to be deeply loved. You are fundamentally worthy of care simply because you exist as a human being, not because of what you constantly provide for everyone else. Healing from compassion fatigue isn't about becoming cold or cynical. I mean, your empathy is a beautiful gift, but the goal is to shift to compassionate detachment, where you can care deeply without absorbing the pain as your own. You learn to stand on the shore and throw a life preserver rather than jumping into the freezing ocean to drown alongside them. So, if you are feeling that suffocating exhaustion today, I really want you to hear this. It is completely okay to drop the heavy cape. Your long, exhausting shift is finally over. It's time to politely excuse yourself from everyone else's emergencies and start gently, beautifully tending to your own wonderfully fragile heart. Look, let's just get right to it. You woke up recently, maybe today, maybe a few months ago, and realized that you just don't care anymore. I mean, you look around and everyone is exhausting themselves over things that suddenly seem completely arbitrary to you. The office politics, the latest social media outrage, keeping up with the seasonal aesthetics, arguing with strangers online, or, aggressively climbing some invisible ladder to nowhere, and you're just sitting there thinking, why does any of this actually matter? It can feel incredibly isolating, right? Like you missed some crucial meeting where everyone else agreed to pretend that this stuff is the absolute center of the universe. Well, I'm here to tell you that you aren't broken. You aren't necessarily depressed either. Though, admittedly, the two can sometimes look a bit similar from the outside. What you are experiencing is actually a deeply documented, psychologically profound phenomenon. It's the psychology of disillusionment, and honestly, it might be the healthiest thing that has ever happened to you. To really understand what's going on in your brain right now, we have to look at how we are wired to care in the first place. You see, from a very young age, we are handed a script, Society, our parents, schools, the media, essentially downloads a set of values into our operating system. Psychologists often refer to these as extrinsic goals. These are things like financial wealth, physical attractiveness, social status, and public validation. We are told, quite literally, that if we acquire these things, we will be happy. So, we run. We get on what psychologists call the hedonic treadmill. We chase the promotion. We buy the trendy clothes. We curate the perfect digital avatar because, well, that's just what you do. But then something shifts. For some people, it happens after a major life event, a loss, a breakup, a sudden career change. But for a lot of us, it just happens quietly. On a random Tuesday, you achieve the thing you were supposed to achieve and you feel nothing. Or worse, you realize you're exhausted. This is where the disillusionment sets in. Now, the word disillusionment often gets a bad rap. It sounds cynical, right? It sounds like you've given up. But if you look at the root of the word itself, to be disillusioned literally means to be freed from an illusion. You are being stripped of a false belief. Think about how liberating that actually is. The illusion was that everyone else's priorities had to be your priorities. When you lose interest in what everyone else cares about, your brain is essentially doing a massive subconscious audit of your cognitive load. In psychology, there's this concept called ego depletion. The basic idea is that we only have a finite amount of willpower, emotional bandwidth, and mental energy to spend each day. For years, you might have been spending your daily allowance of energy on caring about the societal script. You were investing heavily in keeping up appearances, managing how others perceive you, and tracking the endless cycle of pop culture or consumerism. Eventually, your psyche just steps in and says, enough. It recognizes a bad investment. Your brain realizes that the return on investment for caring about these extrinsic, surface-level things is basically zero. It doesn't bring you lasting joy. It just brings anxiety. So it pulls the plug. That sudden loss of interest you feel, that's not apathy. That is your mind forcefully reclaiming its energy. It's an act of psychological self-preservation. You are withdrawing your emotional currency from a market that is fundamentally rigged. And, we also have to talk about the sheer volume of noise in the modern world because it plays a massive role in why you're feeling this way. We are living in an attention economy. Every app, every brand, every news outlet is scientifically optimized to make you care. They hijack your dopamine pathways, creating this constant sense of manufactured urgency. Look at this. Be angry about this. Buy this before it sells out. Look at what this celebrity did. It is relentless. When you are exposed to that level of hyperstimulation for years on end, your dopamine receptors basically get fried. You experience a very real form of sensory and emotional burnout. So when you look at your friends or co-workers getting passionately worked up over a trivial Twitter debate or a superficial workplace drama, and you feel absolutely nothing, it's not because you are cold or unfeeling, it's because your nervous system has adapted. It has built a tolerance, a kind of shield against the manufactured urgency of the modern world. You've subconsciously opted out of the hysteria. Let's look at this through the lens of self-determination theory. This is one of the most widely accepted frameworks for human motivation in psychology today. It argues that for humans to achieve true, lasting well-being, we need to shift from extrinsic motivation, doing things for external rewards, or to avoid external judgments, to intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is when you do something simply because it is inherently rewarding to you. It aligns with your core self. What you are experiencing right now, This profound lack of interest in the hustle or the drama is the messy, sometimes uncomfortable transition phase between these two states. You have detached from the extrinsic motivators. You no longer care about the status, the applause, or the keeping up with the Joneses. But, and here is the tricky part, you might not have fully discovered your intrinsic motivators yet. You are sitting in the void, and sitting in the void can feel really weird. It can make you question your own sanity. You watch everyone else running frantically on their treadmills, sweating and stressing, and because you are standing still, you feel like the crazy one. But you aren't. Actually, standing still is the first necessary step toward finding out what you genuinely value. Carl Jung, the famous analytical psychologist, talked a lot about the phases of life. He suggested that the first half of our lives is entirely about the ego, building an identity, establishing ourselves in society, accumulating things, and fitting in. But the second half of life, the second half is about meaning. It is about discovering who we are apart from society's expectations. This shift doesn't necessarily happen at a specific age anymore. In our hyper-accelerated world, people are hitting this Jungian shift in their 20s and 30s. You are moving from the ego phase to the meaning phase. And the absolute prerequisite for entering the meaning phase is the dismantling of the ego phase. You have to lose interest in the superficial to make room for the profound. You have to let the old desires wither away so that something more authentic can take root. Of course, this transition is incredibly disruptive. It changes how you interact with people. You might find it hard to make small talk at parties anymore. You know, when someone is going on and on about the square footage of their new house or the prestige of their kids' preschool, and you just cannot force yourself to feign excitement. You nod, you smile, but internally the signal is just flatlining. This can lead to a shrinking social circle, which terrifies a lot of people. But even this is a well-documented psychological adaptation. Socio-emotional selectivity theory suggests that as we perceive our time as more limited, whether through aging or just a shift in perspective, we become ruthlessly selective about where we invest our emotional energy. We stop trying to maximize our number of social contacts and start trying to maximize the emotional quality of the few contacts we keep. So yes, you are losing interest in the broad, shallow pool of societal chatter, but you are likely gaining an intense craving for deep, authentic, unfiltered connection. You don't want to talk about what everyone else cares about. You want to talk about what actually matters. You want to talk about existence, about fears, about the absurd beauty of being alive. Look, navigating this space requires a lot of self-compassion. It is entirely normal to feel a bit of grief for the person you used to be, the person who cared, the person who fit in seamlessly. There is a certain comfort in the illusion, isn't there? It's easier, in a way, to just follow the script, to just want the big house, the fancy title, and the socially approved aesthetic. When you step off that path, the road ahead isn't paved anymore. You have to bushwhack your way to your own meaning. And I think, well, it's also crucial to distinguish this from true apathy or clinical depression. That's a trap a lot of people fall into when they try to self-diagnose this feeling. When you are depressed, you lose interest in everything, including the things that used to bring you deep, personal joy. Your emotional baseline drops across the board. But this disillusionment we are talking about, it's highly specific, it's highly selective. You haven't lost the capacity to care. You have just lost the capacity to care about meaningless things. You might find that while you couldn't care less about climbing the corporate ladder, you suddenly care intensely about tending to your garden, or baking bread, or reading philosophy, or just sitting quietly with your dog. Your passion hasn't died. It has just relocated. It has moved out of the noisy city center of societal expectations and taken up residence in the quiet suburbs of your own authentic soul. This selective caring is a sign of psychological maturation. Abraham Maslow, the psychologist who created the hierarchy of needs, studied self-actualized people, individuals who were operating at their highest psychological potential, and one of the key traits he found in these people was a high degree of autonomy and a strong resistance to enculturation. Basically, self-actualized people do not blindly adopt the culture around them. They observe it, they understand it, but they remain emotionally independent from it. They have an internal compass that is so strong, the magnetic pull of the crowd just doesn't affect them anymore. But the reward for this psychological uncoupling is profound freedom. You are no longer easily manipulated by advertising, by peer pressure, or by the fear of missing out. The fear of missing out, or FOMO, eventually evolves into JOMO, the joy of missing out. You start to find an incredibly deep sense of peace in your own non-participation. You see the circus, you hear the clowns, but you realize you don't have to buy a ticket to the show anymore. You can just walk past the tent and look up at the stars instead. So, if you're standing on the sidelines right now, looking at the rat race with a profound sense of indifference, take a deep breath. You aren't falling behind, you are breaking free. So, now that we have established that you aren't broken, the real question becomes, what do you actually do with this newfound, albeit slightly uncomfortable, freedom? I mean, you are standing in the middle of this vast, empty space where all your old ambitions and societal anxieties used to be, and it is eerily quiet. Psychologists often refer to this specific phase as a state of liminality. You know, a liminal space is basically a threshold. It is the in-between. You have let go of the old trappings, the old definitions of success, but you haven't quite grabbed onto the new ones yet. And honestly, this is the part where most people completely panic. They feel the immense discomfort of the void, and instead of just sitting with it, they blindly sprint right back to the treadmill. They convince themselves that they were crazy to ever jump off in the first place. But look, if you can just hold your ground, if you can tolerate this temporary weightlessness, something really beautiful begins to happen. You see, nature absolutely abhors a vacuum, and so does the human psyche. When you completely clear out all the psychological clutter, the desperate need to impress your boss, the exhausting urge to keep up with social trends, the relentless performance of your daily life, you create massive amounts of cognitive real estate. And eventually, almost without you even trying, new things will gently start to bloom in that space. But they won't be the loud, flashy things that society continuously demands. I mean, they will be quiet. They will be entirely yours. This is where we actually start brushing up against existential psychology. Thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Viktor Frankl talked extensively about how meaning isn't something you just casually find lying around. It is something you actively create. You are gracefully shifting from a passive consumer of societal meaning to an active architect of your own personal reality. But look, I have to be completely candid with you here. Building your own meaning is going to cause some friction. You have to prepare yourself for the fact that people in your life are probably going to wildly misunderstand what you are currently going through. When you deeply stop caring about the things they are still desperately striving for, it essentially holds an unyielding mirror right up to their own chaotic lives. And a lot of times, well, they really won't like what they see. They might aggressively accuse you of being lazy or say you've lost your edge. You know, they might even actively try to fix you. It's a very natural human reaction, really. We want the people around us to heavily share our reality because it safely validates our own exhausting choices. When you quietly opt out, it subconsciously invalidates the things they are working so hard to achieve. This is exactly where you have to practice what psychologists in dialectical behavior therapy call radical acceptance. You have to radically accept that your new path is going to highly confuse people and that it is absolutely not your job to translate your authentic soul into a language they understand. I mean, you simply can't drag someone else into your disillusionment, and you certainly can't fully explain the profound peace of the void to someone who is absolutely terrified of the quiet. Radical acceptance means looking at their confusion, feeling the rising urge to desperately justify your lack of interest, and then just letting it completely go. You just nod and you gently let them have their loud opinions. Your internal peace of mind is no longer dependent on their external comprehension. And as you diligently practice this, as you consciously stop trying to heavily explain yourself to everyone, you will likely notice a profound shift in your physical body. It's actually incredible how much physical tension we rigidly carry just from trying to deeply care about completely meaningless things. Our nervous systems are intricately connected to our cognitive dissonance. When you are forcefully engaging in petty office politics or pretending to heavily care about superficial neighborhood gossip, your body registers that incongruence as a low-grade threat. It violently triggers a chronic, subtle stress response. Cortisol continuously drips into your system, your shoulders tense up, your breathing gets incredibly shallow. But when you finally just drop the act, when you look around and quietly say, "You know what? I genuinely do not care about any of this," the physical relief is absolutely palpable. It is exactly like taking off a heavy backpack that you completely forgot you were even wearing. This pure physical release is a massive, highly overlooked part of the entire psychological healing process for a disillusioned mind. It effectively allows your parasympathetic nervous system, the body's natural rest and digest network, to finally take the wheel. And in that deeply rested state, your true intrinsic motivations finally have the ultimate safety required to surface. You might find yourself suddenly drawn back to things you deeply loved when you were a little kid, well before the modern world explicitly told you what you were supposed to value. Maybe you start randomly drawing again, not to sell your art, but just because the tactile feeling of pencil on paper genuinely grounds you. Maybe you start eagerly reading massive historical biographies just for the sheer joy of learning, with absolutely no intention of ever bringing it up to sound intellectually superior to your friends at a local dinner party. See, true intrinsic motivation is intensely protective of its own quiet joy. It genuinely doesn't need a public audience. Actually, it very often prefers not to have one at all. The little things you gently start to care about now will likely be things that you would continue doing even if you were the absolute last person on earth. That is the ultimate psychological litmus test for authentic interest. If nobody could ever know you were doing this, would you still want to enthusiastically do it? When you finally shed the exhausting societal illusions, your life essentially becomes a continuous, beautiful process of passing this strict litmus test. You effortlessly begin to thoughtfully curate your days based on internal resonance, rather than desperately chasing after fleeing, hollow external validation from total strangers. Now, some people will cynically look at this and say, well, isn't that just incredibly selfish? If everyone just completely stopped caring about our society and did what they wanted, the whole world would inevitably fall apart. But honestly, that is a fundamental psychological misunderstanding of human nature. When you deeply lose interest in the superficial, manufactured dramas of modern society, you don't magically lose your humanity. In fact, you very often connect with it on a much deeper, more remarkably authentic level. You stop caring about the societal status of your neighbor's shiny new car, sure, but you start caring incredibly deeply about the actual core emotional well-being of your neighbor. You have the bandwidth to actually care now. Because you are no longer burning all your valuable emotional fuel on completely trivial, meaningless, everyday things, you actually have the vital emotional reserves to finally show up. You effortlessly become highly capable of genuine, profound emotional empathy. When someone is actively grieving, when someone is secretly suffering, you can safely sit with them in the dark without awkwardly trying to offer toxic positivity, simply because you are no longer terrified of the dark yourself. You've patiently sat in your own heavy void. You intimately know the rough territory firsthand. By deliberately detaching from the frantic, superficial layer of our society, you actually become a far more grounded, deeply compassionate member of the human race. You organically become a sturdy, reliable anchor. The less you care about what everyone else aggressively cares about, the more impactful your presence actually becomes. Think about the specific people in your own life who radiate a genuine, unshakable sense of peace. They are rarely the loudest people in the room, right? They aren't the ones desperately trying to constantly prove their worth or loudly assert their opinions. They are the ones who are just comfortably, quietly themselves. They are deeply unbothered by the circus happening around them. And because they are genuinely unbothered, people are naturally drawn to them like a magnet. When you powerfully stop striving for external validation, you inadvertently become a guiding beacon for others who are secretly exhausted and desperately looking for a way out. So, as you slowly navigate the days and weeks ahead, I genuinely want you to actively reframe how you look at this profound internal shift. When you heavily feel that massive wave of profound indifference washing over you during a pointless corporate meeting or while mindlessly scrolling through your phone, please don't judge it. Don't wrongly label it as a personal flaw or a lazy failure to engage with the world. Simply acknowledge it as a deeply intelligent, highly evolved protective mechanism. Your brilliant mind is carefully building a fortress. It is purposefully pulling up the heavy drawbridge to keep the overwhelming noise out, so that you can finally, truly hear your own authentic thoughts for the very first time. And, it is perfectly okay if your bright new life actively looks overwhelmingly ordinary from the outside. We have been fiercely sold this disastrous, exhausting lie that a meaningful life has to be an extraordinary, highly visible life. We are aggressively told we have to dramatically change the entire world, disrupt massive industries, or blindly build global empires. But frankly, that is just another hollow, profitable illusion. A truly meaningful life is very often incredibly simple, remarkably quiet, and completely unmarketable. You are simply waking up from a chaotic dream that was never yours to begin with. You have finally realized that there is absolutely nowhere you need to aggressively go and absolutely nothing you need to desperately prove. You're exhausted, and honestly, not just the kind of tired that a solid 8 hours of sleep can fix. You are deeply, fundamentally drained, mainly because you are a deep thinker living in a world that, well, only seems to reward the relentless doer. We exist in this era of hyperproductivity, where if you aren't monetizing your hobbies, optimizing your morning routine, or grinding out incredibly long days, you're somehow falling behind. But here is the direct truth. Modern hustle culture isn't just tiring, it is actively destroying the deep thinker's soul. And I don't use the word soul lightly here. I mean your core psychological well-being, your capacity for profound insight, and your ability to simply exist without feeling guilty. Look, society has essentially convinced us that stillness is laziness. I mean, think about it for a second. When was the last time you sat on your couch doing absolutely nothing without a creeping sense of panic that you should be answering an email or doing something productive? We are heavily conditioned to view our self-worth strictly through the lens of our output. But for the deep thinker, this is literal psychological sabotage. Deep thinking, by its very nature, requires space. It requires time. It requires, well, emptiness. It demands the exact opposite of what hustle culture dictates. Hustle culture screams at us to fill every void with action, while the introspective brain desperately needs the void to actually process the complex nuances of life. So let's kind of break down what is actually happening in your brain when you force a reflective mind into a perpetual state of hustle. In psychology and neuroscience, there's this fascinating concept called the default mode network, or the DMN. You can sort of think of the DMN as your brain's background processing mode. It activates when you are not actively focused on the outside world. When you're daydreaming, staring out a window, or just going for a walk without a podcast blaring in your ears, your DMN lights up. This network is entirely responsible for deep self-reflection, creativity, empathy, and consolidating your memories. It is literally the neurological home of the deep thinker. But here is the problem. Hustle culture demands that we constantly engage the opposite system, which is our task-positive network. This is the part of the brain that turns on when we are actively solving a problem, ticking off a to-do list, or responding to constant external stimuli. And, the catch is that these two neural networks operate entirely like a seesaw. When one is turned on, the other is completely suppressed. You literally cannot be in a state of constant, grinding productivity and engage in deep, meaningful thought at the exact same time. The brain just doesn't work that way. So when you buy into this modern idea that every second must be utilized, you are effectively starving your default mode network. Highly conscientious people, which most deep thinkers tend to be, are uniquely susceptible to this toxic trap. You care deeply about the quality of your work, right? You want to be responsible, you want to be seen as reliable, and you genuinely want to contribute meaning to the world. So when the culture tells you that the only way to be valuable is to be perpetually on, you internalize that message completely. You take it as a moral imperative. You push yourself past your natural biological limits because, you just don't want to let anyone down. But in doing so, you are actively participating in the rapid erosion of your own psychological foundation to satisfy a cultural norm that doesn't actually care about you as a human being. I mean, it is absolutely no wonder we are walking around feeling so hollowed out, right? We have traded profound contemplation for cheap, quick dopamine hits. Every time you cross something off your list, or reply to a message within 30 seconds, you get a tiny squirt of dopamine. It feels really good in the moment, sort of like genuine progress, but it is entirely superficial. Dopamine is the neurochemical of anticipation and reward. It is not the neurochemical of fulfillment. True fulfillment, contentment, and that deep sense of inner peace actually come from serotonin and oxytocin, which are cultivated through human connection, stillness, and slow, deliberate living. Hustle culture basically hacks our dopamine system, turning us into exhausted hamsters on a wheel. Well, what actually happens when we push a sensitive, deep-thinking brain into this severe state of chronic depletion? The brain doesn't just quietly give up, it actually starts to violently misfire. When you are overworked and heavily underrested, your amygdala, which is basically the brain's primitive alarm system, becomes incredibly hyperactive. You are chronically bathing your brain in cortisol, the primary stress hormone, because hustle culture artificially manufactures a constant state of life or death urgency. A late email suddenly feels like a dangerous predator chasing you. A missed
Your fried
deadline
nervous
feels
system
like a
completely
loses the ability to distinguish between a minor daily inconvenience and an actual legitimate existential threat. And this right here is exactly where the psychology of hustle culture bleeds into something incredibly painful for the deep thinker: social rumination. Because your nervous system is completely exhausted, your brain starts desperately scanning your immediate environment for threats to keep you safe. But since there are no literal predators around in your office or your living room, it turns its hyper-vigilant gaze inward, specifically toward your social interactions. Have you ever found yourself lying awake at 2 a.m., agonizing over a tiny, seemingly insignificant comment you made to a coworker 3 days ago? You know, that horrible moment where you replay the scene in your head over and over again, tweaking your tone, imagining their judgment, and basically spiraling into a deep pit of self-doubt? I mean, we all do it to some extent, but for the emotionally exhausted deep thinker, it becomes a literal psychological prison. When your mind is completely denied the healthy, spacious environment it needs to process the world properly, it simply turns on itself. It takes a completely neutral, throwaway interaction, like accidentally saying you too when a barista tells you to enjoy your coffee, and it magnifies it into this massive, catastrophic failure of basic social grace. You are essentially trapped in an endless, agonizing feedback loop of perceived social blunders. And it is exhausting, isn't it? It drains whatever tiny reserve of mental energy you somehow had left from your overly demanding day. Look, the real reason you ruminate isn't because you are broken, and it's certainly not because you are inherently awkward as a person. You ruminate because your brain's threat detection system is permanently stuck in the on position, and your logical filters are just too tired to shut it off. In clinical psychology, this kind of rumination is closely linked to something called the Zeigarnik effect, which is this established principle that our brains remember incomplete or interrupted tasks far better than completed ones. When a casual social interaction leaves you feeling slightly uncertain, maybe the person didn't smile as much as usual, your overly stressed brain automatically tags that interaction as an incomplete task. It flags it as an unresolved social threat. So it keeps bringing it back up to your conscious awareness, over and over again, constantly demanding that you solve it. But there is nothing to actually solve, right? The conversation is completely over. It happened days ago. Yet you sit there endlessly dissecting every micro-expression, every awkward pause, every single word you chose. Did she think I was being passive-aggressive? Why on earth did I use that specific weird phrase? You are applying your profound analytical processing power to something that absolutely does not warrant it. It is a massive misallocation of your cognitive resources, driven entirely by a stressed brain that has been pushed way past its breaking point by the unnatural demands of modern life. It's actually fascinating, well, terrifying but fascinating, how our minds can trap us like this. We engage in this obsessive mental replay because some vulnerable part of us genuinely believes that if we just analyze the interaction enough, if we just think about it from every single possible angle, we can somehow magically change the past outcome, or at least protect ourselves from making the exact same mistake in the future. It is a deeply misguided attempt at problem solving, but, you cannot actually solve the past. You can only torture yourself with it in the present, and every single time you replay that specific uncomfortable memory, you are physically reinforcing the neural pathways of anxiety, making it so much easier to fall into the exact same trap tomorrow. So, how do we actually escape this? I mean, how do we fundamentally stop our highly analytical, deeply sensitive minds from just aggressively chewing on these tiny, completely insignificant social interactions? Well, the very first thing you have to understand is that you absolutely cannot think your way out of overthinking. It is honestly like trying to put out a roaring fire by throwing buckets of gasoline on it. Your brain is essentially stuck in a hyper-analytical overdrive, so applying even more analysis to the situation is only going to make the rumination deeper, stronger, and a lot more painful. Instead, we have to fundamentally shift how we relate to the thoughts themselves. In acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, there is this incredibly powerful, heavily researched technique called cognitive diffusion. Basically, it means learning to untangle yourself from your thoughts, creating a space between you and the mental noise. You see, when you ruminate, you are totally fused with your thoughts. You treat the passing thought, my coworker absolutely hates me, or I sounded so stupid in that meeting, as an absolute, undeniable, hard-coded fact. But, a thought is really just a transient firing of neurons. It's a temporary mental event, a sort of hypothesis your brain is offering up, not an objective reality. So the next time you find yourself spiraling at 2 in the morning, I want you to try something slightly different. Instead of agonizing over the content of the thought, instead of analyzing the interaction itself and trying to solve the puzzle, just label the mental process. You literally say to yourself, out loud if you have to, I am noticing that I am having the thought that I embarrass myself. It sounds, well, almost too simple to work, right? But psychologically speaking, adding that specific phrase creates a critical bit of distance. You are instantly stepping back into the role of the neutral observer, which immediately takes the emotional charge right out of the rumination. And then, you have to bring your physical body into the equation, because modern hustle culture forces us to live entirely in our heads, constantly planning, plotting, and optimizing. We become completely disconnected from our physical somatic experience. Your racing, ruminating mind is basically a glaring symptom of a highly dysregulated nervous system. Your sympathetic nervous system is firing off constantly, screaming that you are in some kind of mortal danger. So, to genuinely stop the mental loop, you have to send a very clear physical signal of safety to your body. You do this by intentionally engaging your parasympathetic nervous system, which is your body's rest and digest mode. Doing something as simple as taking a long, incredibly slow exhale, where the breath out is actually significantly longer than the breath in, directly stimulates your vagus nerve. And that, well, it physically slows down your heart rate and chemically signals to your frantic brain that you are actually safe in your environment. You literally cannot be physiologically relaxed and deeply cognitively anxious at the exact same time. But look, these psychological techniques, as incredibly helpful and scientifically valid as they are really just putting a bandage on the much larger, more systemic issue. If you actually want to protect your deep thinking soul from burning out completely, you have to radically change the way you interact with the modern world. You have to actively, intentionally embrace the psychology of slow living. And, let's be entirely clear about what slow living actually is, because it is massively misunderstood in our culture today. Slow living is not about moving at a literal snail's pace, and it's certainly not about giving up on your ambitions, moving to a secluded cabin in the woods, or simply being lazy and unproductive. That is just the hustle culture's incredibly skewed, biased definition of anything that isn't constant, grinding, monetizable output. Instead, slow living is the deeply intentional choice to operate at your natural biological rhythm, rather than the artificially frantic pace dictated by modern capitalist society. It is a conscious, deliberate decision to do fewer things, but to do them with significantly more depth, care, and presence. For the deep thinker, slow living is essentially an act of radical self-preservation. It is about intentionally designing a daily life that actively supports and nourishes the default mode network we talked about earlier. It means deliberately carving out space in your day for absolutely nothing. And yes, I literally mean nothing at all. Not meditating, not listening to an educational podcast on double speed, not practicing structured mindfulness, just allowing yourself the profound, unstructured freedom to simply exist without any agenda whatsoever. When you first try this, it is going to feel incredibly uncomfortable, I guarantee it. Your brain, which has been highly conditioned by years of hustle culture to crave constant stimulation, instant dopamine, and the validation of ticking things off a list, is going to throw a massive, overwhelming temper tantrum. You will probably feel an intense sense of guilt, like you are somehow wasting precious time and falling behind your peers. But you absolutely have to gently, patiently push through that initial wave of discomfort. You have to profoundly understand that boredom, or just cognitive stillness, is actually the fertile soil where all of your best, most insightful ideas take root. When you stop force-feeding your brain a constant diet of external information, it finally has the necessary space to digest, to synthesize, to connect disparate dots, and to create real meaning. You are finally allowing your deep-thinking nature to literally breathe. And embracing this lifestyle absolutely requires a fundamental core shift in how you view your own identity. Hustle culture is so incredibly insidious precisely because it successfully convinces us that our intrinsic value as living human beings is inextricably tied to our external output. If you produce a lot, if you are continuously busy, you are a good, valuable, important person. If you rest, you are somehow failing the system. You have to forcefully, consciously reject that toxic narrative. Your worth is absolutely not a metric that goes up and down based on how many emails you answered today or how many arbitrary tasks you completed. You have to start valuing yourself for your capacity to feel deeply, to observe the world thoughtfully, to empathize with others, and to connect authentically. I mean, those are incredibly beautiful, essential human traits, but they are completely unquantifiable. You can't put them on a spreadsheet or a quarterly review, which is exactly why hustle culture entirely dismisses them as useless. So you have to start setting some really ruthless, non-negotiable boundaries, not just with other people, but with yourself, and especially with your technology. I mean, let's be honest, the smartphone is basically a pocket-sized hustle culture machine that constantly, relentlessly demands your attention. If you want to genuinely embrace slow living and protect your mental energy, you absolutely have to reclaim your physical and psychological space from these addictive devices. You know, try leaving your phone entirely in another room for just an hour a day. Go for a long walk without your smartwatch meticulously tracking your every step and heartbeat. Give yourself the profound, liberating permission to simply be unreachable for a little while. When you stop treating every single buzz, beep, and notification as a life or death emergency, your fried nervous system can finally start to power down. The constant, low-grade background hum of anxiety actually begins to fade away into silence. And as you intentionally start to slow down and rebuild your internal ecosystem, you will probably notice something incredibly beautiful and transformative happening to your social rumination. It won't necessarily disappear completely overnight because the brain genuinely loves its familiar habits, but it will absolutely lose its intense, paralyzing grip on your reality. Because when your nervous system is consistently calm, and when you are no longer operating from a deep, chronic place of exhaustion, your brain fundamentally stops perceiving every single minor social interaction as a massive existential threat to your survival. You will find that you can actually look back on an awkward conversation or a slightly embarrassing comment and just, well, laugh about it. You can clearly recognize that you are just a flawed, completely imperfect human being interacting with other flawed, completely imperfect human beings. And that is perfectly, wonderfully okay. I mean, you will finally have the psychological and emotional bandwidth to extend real grace, not just to the people around you, but much more importantly, to yourself. You will stop demanding robotic perfection from your social interactions because you will no longer view yourself as a machine meant to flawlessly perform in every given scenario. You will start to realize that the minor social blunders you used to agonize over for weeks are actually just the tiny, insignificant ripples in the vast ocean of your life, completely forgotten by everyone else almost the moment they happen. Slow living gives you the ultimate gift of perspective. It beautifully shrinks the terrifying magnitude of your overthinking and restores your mind to a state of healthy, proportionate reality. You know, living this way, completely defying the modern narrative, takes a tremendous amount of courage. It really, truly does. It is not at all easy to be the one person walking slowly, intentionally, and deliberately, while the rest of the world is desperately sprinting toward a finish line that doesn't actually exist. You will likely face a lot of misunderstanding from friends or family. People might legitimately think you lack ambition, that you've lost your edge, or that you just don't care about success anymore. But you have to fiercely, unapologetically protect your inner peace anyway, because the alternative, sacrificing your deep-thinking, sensitive soul on the cold altar of endless productivity, is simply too devastatingly high a price to pay. Your profound depth, your high sensitivity, and your natural capacity for deep reflection are absolutely not liabilities to be optimized away or medicated. They are your absolute greatest, most beautiful strengths. So I really want to leave you with this final, very direct and honest thought as we wrap this up. The very next time you feel that heavy, familiar, suffocating pressure to do more, to be more, to hustle harder just to prove your worth, just pause. Just stop for one single, completely unoptimized moment. Take a deep, intentional, grounding breath. Remind yourself consciously that you absolutely do not owe the world your constant exhaustion. You do not have to earn your right to simply exist on this planet. You are allowed to take your time. You are completely allowed to let the text message wait until tomorrow. You are allowed to let your beautiful, complex mind wander aimlessly without producing anything of tangible value. Embrace the quiet, deeply radical power of the slow, deliberate life. Because, well, A mind that is finally given the genuine freedom to rest is a mind that can eventually profoundly change the world. You're probably sitting there right now, acutely aware of a ticking clock. Not like the literal one on your wall, but that invisible internal countdown reminding you of absolutely everything you haven't achieved yet. You've been told your whole life that you have so much potential. But instead of feeling like a compliment, well, it feels like a threat, doesn't it? It feels like this massive, overwhelming debt you somehow owe to the universe. And frankly, you have absolutely no idea how you're ever going to pay it back. You know exactly what you could do. You have the intelligence and the capacity to do it. And yet, you are just completely paralyzed. Let's rewind a little bit and look at where this starts. Think back to when you were a kid. If you're engaging with this right now, chances are you were the gifted child. You learned to read early, You probably aced tests without even opening a textbook. And adults constantly praised you for being just so incredibly smart. It felt really great at the time, right? I mean, who doesn't like being told they are special and exceptional? But here's the thing. What those well-meaning parents and teachers were actually doing was unknowingly setting a psychological trap. They weren't praising your effort or your resilience. They were praising an innate, unearned trait. They were handing you a heavy, incredibly fragile crown and basically saying, whatever you do, don't drop this. So you learned very quickly that your entire worth as a human being was entirely tied to being the smartest person in the room. This brings us to a really fascinating psychological concept, actually. It's what the renowned psychologist Carol Dweck identifies as the fixed mindset. When you're constantly told that you are inherently smart, you start to deeply believe that your intelligence is just this fixed, unchangeable trait, kind of like your eye color or your height. You either have it or you completely don't. And if you have it, well, things are supposed to come easily to you without any real struggle. So, what exactly happens when you finally encounter a challenge in the real world that requires actual painful sustained effort? Well, panic completely sets in. Because if you have to try hard, or worse, if you actually fail at something, it must mean you aren't actually that smart after all. And if you aren't smart, then, who are you? Your entire identity is suddenly on the line, crumbling beneath your feet. So how does an intelligent person protect that fragile, carefully constructed identity? Through paralysis. Through doing absolutely nothing at all. Think about it for a second. Procrastination is often completely misunderstood by society as mere laziness. People will look at you and say, oh, they just don't have the drive, or they lack motivation. But honestly, that couldn't be further from the psychological truth. For highly intelligent people burdened with sky-high expectations, procrastination is actually a highly sophisticated subconscious defense mechanism. It's a brilliant way to protect yourself from the devastating reality that your absolute best effort might still not be good enough. Because, well, if you never finish writing that novel, or if you never actually launch that business or apply for that dream job, it remains a flawless, perfect possibility in your mind. You can't fail at something you never actually try. But of course, living entirely in the realm of pure possibility comes with a terrible heavy price, doesn't it? And that price is the infamous wasted potential guilt. It's this constant gnawing feeling right in the pit of your stomach that just won't go away. You look around at the world and you see people who are, let's be totally honest here, maybe objectively less talented or less intellectually gifted than you are, but they are out there actually achieving things. They are living their lives, making mistakes, and moving forward. And you are just sitting in your room, overthinking your own life into total oblivion. You feel this profound, suffocating sense of guilt because you feel like you are hoarding a precious gift. It's kind of like you were handed a winning lottery ticket at birth, but you're just too terrified to walk out the front door to actually cash it in. Now let's look at another major reason why this psychological paralysis happens, which is the paradox of choice. Highly intelligent people usually have incredibly active, wonderfully complex minds. They don't just look at a situation and see one simple path forward. They immediately see 50 different diverging paths. And because their brains are so highly analytical, they instantly and automatically foresee the potential pitfalls, the hidden risks, and the statistical likelihood of failure for every single one of those paths. It's just exhausting to live like that. while someone else might just pick a direction and blindly start running with enthusiasm. The highly intelligent person is standing frozen at the starting line, calculating the wind resistance, the terrain gradient, and the exact probability of twisting an ankle. By the time they've finally figured out the absolute, objectively perfect route to take, the race is basically already over. And that naturally brings us to the beast itself, perfectionism. We so often talk about perfectionism in our culture like it's just a cute little quirky trait, Like in a job interview when people say, "Oh, my biggest weakness is just that I'm such a perfectionist, my desk has to be perfectly organized." But clinical, deeply rooted psychological perfectionism is actually incredibly destructive. It's the rigid, unforgiving belief that if something isn't absolutely flawless, it is completely worthless. For the gifted adult who is actively suffering from wasted potential guilt, perfectionism is the ultimate paralytic agent. If you can't write a generational masterpiece, why write at all? If you can't build a billion-dollar world-changing startup, why even bother opening a small sustainable business? The gap between your exceptional taste, which is usually excellent because you are, in fact, smart, and your current practical abilities is just way too painful to even look at. Let's really dig into the gap for a second, because it's so crucial to understanding this guilt. Broadcaster Ira Glass famously talked about this gap in relation to creative work, but honestly, it applies to almost everything in a highly intelligent person's life. Because you have high cognitive abilities, your taste, your vision, and your internal expectations are incredibly high right from the very start. But your practical skills, the actual execution of the thing, well, those take years of grinding time to build, just like they do for anyone else on the planet. So when you actually try to do something, the result naturally falls vastly short of the magnificent, shimmering vision you had in your head. And because you aren't used to being bad at things, this gap feels like an intolerable, humiliating failure. You instantly feel like a complete fraud. So you quit. Or worse, to protect yourself, you just never start in the first place. But it's really not just an emotional issue, actually. There's a very real cognitive component happening here too, deeply related to what psychologists call executive dysfunction. Sometimes highly intelligent people have incredibly powerful engines in their brains, so to speak, but the steering wheel and the brakes are completely shot. Executive function involves the ability to plan, to initiate tasks, and to break massive, overwhelming goals down into small, manageable steps. When your brain is used to grasping massive, complex concepts almost instantaneously, it very often skips the crucial developmental step of learning how to systematically learn or how to work sequentially. So when you are finally faced with a massive, unstructured life project like building a meaningful career or finding your life's purpose, the brain just completely short-circuits. It's too big, it's way too abstract, and there's no clear, step-by-step syllabus to follow. You see, what ultimately happens is that this incredible intellect turns entirely inward on itself. When a powerful, analytical mind doesn't have an immediate external problem to solve, it starts trying to solve itself, or rather, destroying itself in the process. You start creating these massive, labyrinthine mental constructs where you literally argue yourself out of taking any possible action. You sit there and think, well, if I do X, then Y will eventually happen, which will inevitably lead to Z. And since Z is ultimately meaningless in the grand cosmic scheme of the expanding universe, why should I even bother starting? You literally think your way out of living your life. It's a psychological form of intellectualization, which is just another clever defense mechanism. Because, if you can analyze your own feelings of deep guilt and paralysis from a safe, detached, highly academic perspective, you don't actually have to sit there and feel the pain of them. But the guilt always comes back, doesn't it? It just forms this relentless, inescapable, vicious cycle. You feel incredibly guilty for not doing anything productive, which naturally makes you feel depressed, inadequate, and highly anxious. That heavy depression and anxiety completely drain your physical and mental energy, making it even harder to drum up the motivation to start doing anything at all. So you continue doing absolutely nothing, which, predictably, only increases the crushing weight of the guilt. It's exactly like being trapped in a pit of psychological quicksand. The more you thrash and struggle with the abstract idea of what you feel you should be doing, the deeper you sink into the actual reality of doing nothing. And all the while, that harsh inner critic, which ironically usually sounds exactly like the voices of the adults who praised you so highly as a child, only much, much meaner now, is just screaming at you about your failures. And completely intertwined with all of this emotional chaos is the classic, ever-present imposter syndrome. Even if you do somehow manage to push through the paralysis and achieve something objectively great, the wasted potential guilt doesn't necessarily go away. You know why? Because your brain instantly minimizes the achievement. You assume that since it came somewhat easily to you, or since you completely procrastinated until the very last possible minute and still somehow pulled it off, it doesn't actually count as a real achievement. You honestly feel like you just hacked the system rather than actually earning the result through merit. You think to yourself, sure, I got the degree or I landed the impressive job, but I'm secretly only operating at maybe 20% of my actual capacity. If they knew how chronically lazy and disorganized I actually am, they would fire me on the spot. You are constantly, obsessively moving the goalposts on yourself, ensuring that you never ever get to feel the quiet satisfaction of having finally reached your so-called potential. So we are ultimately left with an entire generation of incredibly bright, deeply unhappy individuals who are just standing frozen on the sidelines of their own lives. These are people who genuinely possess the raw cognitive horsepower to cure diseases, to write brilliant culture-shifting literature, or to build incredible world-changing communities, but who are instead just scrolling mindlessly through their phones at 2 a.m., completely paralyzed by the overwhelming, suffocating weight of their own infinite possibilities. The tragedy isn't just that society and the world at large are missing out on their brilliant contributions. The real tragedy, the truly heartbreaking, invisible part of all of this, is the immense quiet suffering happening every single day inside their own heads. It's the daily silent mourning of a vibrant life unlived, not because of any actual lack of ability or intelligence, but because of an absolute paralyzing overload of it. So how do we actually, break out of this? How do you finally step out of that suffocating mental prison you've painstakingly built for yourself and actually start living the life that is just sitting there waiting for you? Because honestly, just understanding the psychological trap isn't quite enough, is it? You can sit there and analyze your own intellectual paralysis until the literal end of time. But analysis is often just another highly sophisticated form of hiding. The real work, the actual messy, terribly uncomfortable work, begins with fundamentally dismantling this incredibly toxic concept of potential. You really have to look closely at that word and realize what it actually means. Potential is literally just unrealized energy, nothing more. It absolutely does not mean a guaranteed, flawless outcome. It certainly doesn't mean some grand historic destiny you are somehow forced to fulfill just to be deemed worthy of taking up space and breathing air on this planet. Potential is a simple capacity, not a massive, overwhelming debt you owe to society. And the very first step to freeing yourself is mentally giving yourself full, radical permission to completely default on that imaginary debt. You owe the universe absolutely nothing except your own authentic, messy happiness. You see, what you actually need to do next is entirely rewire that fixed mindset that has been holding you completely hostage since childhood. Remember how we talked earlier about being constantly praised just for being naturally smart rather than for working hard or showing grit? Well, to undo that deeply ingrained damage, you have to consciously start valuing effort over natural aptitude. And I know that sounds incredibly cliche, like something you'd read on a cheesy, faded motivational poster in a high school counselor's office, but it is psychologically profound. You have to start actually celebrating the struggle. When you sit down to learn something completely new or to start a challenging project, and you immediately feel that familiar hot wave of frustration, that sudden desperate urge to just quit because it isn't instantly effortless, you have to train your complex brain to recognize that exact feeling as a purely positive signal. That feeling of immense friction isn't proof that you're a fraud or an imposter. It is actually the literal biological sensation of your brain forming brand new neural pathways. It means you are finally, at long last, doing something worthwhile, something that is actually challenging you to grow. And that naturally leads us to perhaps the most terrifying, yet absolutely liberating concept for a highly intelligent perfectionist. You have to give yourself radical, uncompromising permission to just be completely, embarrassingly bad at things. Like, seriously, truly awful. I really want you to think about this for a second, because we are always told the exact opposite. We are told that if anything is worth doing, it's worth doing well. But actually, anything worth doing is absolutely worth doing poorly at first. If you want to write a novel, you have to allow yourself to write the absolute most garbage, unreadable, horrific first draft in the entire history of the English language. If you want to start a business, you have to be totally okay with having a messy, incredibly clumsy launch that maybe only your mum and two of your friends even notice. You have to actively, purposefully lower your unbelievably high standards just to get yourself physically over that initial starting line, because a terrible, poorly executed reality is infinitely more valuable and infinitely more real than a flawless, shimmering illusion that only exists safely inside your own head. You can always edit a bad page, right? But you literally cannot edit a blank one. Bridging that terrible vast gap between your incredibly high taste and your currently unpolished skills is going to be incredibly painful. There is simply no clever way around that, honestly. You're going to look at your early work or your early fumbling attempts at whatever big goal you're chasing, and you're going to feel a profound, physically painful sense of cringe. But instead of letting that cringe completely paralyze you and send you running back to the safety of doing nothing, you desperately need to reframe it. Cringe is actually a beautiful, essential metric of your personal growth. If you look back at something you did 6 months ago and you don't cringe at least a little bit, it means you haven't grown, you haven't learned, and you haven't evolved at all. The only possible way to close the gap between your taste and your ability is through sheer, relentless, unapologetic volume of work. You just have to make a lot of stuff. You have to put in the incredibly boring reps. And while you are doing that, you have to deliberately, consciously disconnect your deeply held sense of self-worth from the immediate, tangible outcome of that work. You are not your project. You are not your creative output. You are simply a human being in the messy, non-linear, totally normal process of practicing. Now let's talk about the practical, everyday side of things, specifically dealing with that brutal executive dysfunction we touched on. Highly intelligent people so often fail not because they lack a grand, sweeping, brilliant vision, but because they completely lack a daily, mundane, incredibly boring system. You absolutely love focusing on the massive end goal, the published novel, the wildly successful company, the perfectly optimized career, because that is highly intellectually stimulating. But the actual day-to-day reality of achieving those incredible things is often, well, just incredibly boring. It's just doing small, unglamorous, repetitive tasks over and over again. So, to beat the paralysis, you actually have to stop thinking about the big goals entirely. Seriously, just put them completely out of your brilliantly active mind. Instead, focus entirely on building microscopic, almost insultingly easy daily systems. Don't say, I'm going to write a best-selling novel this year. Say, I am going to write for literally 5 minutes every single morning while my coffee is brewing, and then I'm going to stop. The goal isn't to magically produce a masterpiece in those 5 short minutes. The real goal is simply to build the identity of someone who actually shows up. Momentum, you see, is absolutely everything. Another massive fundamental shift you have to make is moving completely away from what society casually expects of your towering intellect and leaning heavily into what actually genuinely sparks your own deeply personal curiosity. A huge portion of that agonizing, wasted potential guilt actually comes from a deep internal misalignment. You are probably constantly beating yourself up for not pursuing ambitious goals that you don't even actually care about in the first place. You sit there and think, well, I'm highly capable and everyone knows I'm smart, so I definitely should be a doctor or an engineer or a high-powered CEO. But maybe, just maybe, what you actually want to do with your one precious life is something completely different. Something vastly quieter, or more creative, or totally unconventional. And because your highly analytical brain knows you are perfectly capable of walking the prestigious paths, it relentlessly punishes you for not walking them. You have to bravely strip all of those loud external shoulds completely away. What would you actually do with your fleeting time on Earth if absolutely nobody was ever going to grade you, eagerly judge you, or loudly applaud you for it? Finding that intrinsic motivation, that quiet, steady hum of genuine, unforced interest, is the absolute ultimate antidote to the crushing weight of external expectations. We also really need to radically, permanently redefine your entire relationship with the concept of failure. For the typical former gifted child, failure feels completely catastrophic. It feels deeply personal, like a total, humiliating invalidation of your very existence and identity. But, objectively speaking, failure is literally just data. That is absolutely all it is. It's just the universe casually giving you neutral, completely emotionless feedback on a very specific approach. When a trained scientist runs a complex experiment and it doesn't work, they don't fall to the cold floor crying and loudly declare themselves a totally worthless human being who is tragically wasting their scientific potential. They just calmly look at the new data, adjust the variables, and run the experiment again. You have to genuinely start treating your own life like a grand, messy, completely forgiving laboratory. When you boldly try something and it completely flops, it honestly doesn't mean you are uniquely broken or that your lauded intelligence was a total lie all along. It just means that one particular strategy didn't work. It is merely a stepping stone, a crucially important piece of information that you actively needed to figure out what to exactly do next. Taking the heavy emotion and shame completely out of failure is just incredibly liberating. Ultimately, this entire difficult journey of breaking out of your intellectual paralysis is profoundly about radical, unwavering self-compassion. You have to actively, consciously forgive yourself for all the years you spent hiding safely in the shadows of your own overwhelming expectations. You absolutely cannot get that paralyzed time back, and obsessing over the fact that you lost it is just another clever way your brain is trying to keep you stuck in the present moment. Your incredible potential was never actually wasted, It was just quietly, patiently waiting for you to finally feel safe enough to use it without the terrifying fear of complete destruction. The deeply ingrained habits of a lifetime, the intense perfectionism, the crippling overthinking, the profound fear of being completely average are absolutely not going to magically vanish overnight just because you finally understand them. You are definitely going to stumble, and you're going to have days where the sheer weight of the guilt feels impossibly heavy again. But that is exactly when you have to be the absolute kindest to yourself. So, I really want you to take a deep, grounding breath right now. Acknowledge the brilliant, beautiful, incredibly complicated mind that you have, but also gently, firmly remind yourself that it is a tool meant to help you actively navigate the world, not a harsh, unyielding master meant to endlessly terrorize you. The invisible clock on the wall is definitely still ticking, yes, but it isn't counting down to your inevitable shameful failure. It is just quietly marking the precious time you have left to go out there and make a beautifully spectacular, thoroughly ordinary, totally human mess of things. Go write the absolutely terrible first chapter. Go launch the incredibly clunky, embarrassing project. Go be gloriously, wonderfully, unrecognizably bad at something you actually care about. Because a life that is actually fully lived, with all of its many flaws, devastating mistakes, and completely average moments, is infinitely more beautiful than a perfect, pristine life that was entirely wasted just endlessly thinking about living. You have so much brilliant time left. Just, please, start using it badly. Have you ever found yourself saying no to a completely simple request, but then, immediately following it up with a 5-minute detailed monologue about exactly why you can't do it? Or, have you ever drafted a super quick email, something that really only needed to be 2 short sentences, but it somehow magically turned into a massive 3-paragraph essay just because you were absolutely terrified that the person reading it might misinterpret your tone? Well, if you are nodding your head right now, you are definitely not alone in this. Actually, what we are talking about here is something so many of us struggle with. It's the chronic need to explain yourself, and, I really want to make it clear right from the start that this isn't just some quirky little personality trait or a sign that you just love to hear yourself talk. No, it is actually a deeply ingrained psychological response. For over-analyzers, over-communicating is almost never about dominating a conversation. It's basically rooted in a profound, incredibly exhausting fear of being misunderstood. So, let's kind of break down what is actually happening in the brain of an over-analyzer when they start to over-communicate. You see, when you have this chronic need to justify every little action, thought, or boundary, your brain is basically treating normal social interactions like a high-stakes game of chess. I mean, you aren't just saying words, you are trying to anticipate every single possible way the other person could take those words. You're like playing out all the worst-case scenarios in your head in real time. What if they think I'm being selfish? Or, what if they think I don't care about their feelings? Or, what if they get mad and leave? To an overanalyzer, leaving any sort of ambiguity in a conversation feels incredibly dangerous. It's almost like leaving a door wide open in a bad neighborhood at night. You just feel completely exposed. So you use words as a shield. You pile on the context, the backstories, and the disclaimers, thinking that if you can just give them enough information, they won't be able to form a negative opinion of you. But, well, let's really think about why being misunderstood feels so terrifying in the first place. For most people, a simple misunderstanding is just, a minor bump in the road. It's an awkward moment that you quickly clarify and then you just move on. But for the chronic over-explainer, being misunderstood doesn't just feel like a small social hiccup. It literally feels like a threat to your core identity and your safety. I mean, when someone misunderstands your intentions, it triggers this deep, visceral panic. And psychology actually gives us a lot of insight into why this happens. It basically comes down to how our brains are wired for connection and survival. In our evolutionary past, being outcast from the tribe meant certain death. So if your brain perceives that someone is forming a negative and false narrative about you, it sets off the alarm bells. It's like your internal security system is screaming that you are about to be rejected, abandoned, or punished just because the other person didn't get what you actually meant. And, to really understand this, we have to look back at where this behavior usually starts. Because nobody is just born feeling this intense pressure to write an essay every time they decline a dinner invitation. This chronic need to explain yourself is almost always a learned survival mechanism, and it usually stems directly from childhood or from past toxic relationships. Think about it. If you grew up in an environment where your feelings were constantly invalidated, or where your intentions were always assumed to be malicious, you learned very quickly that you were not safe simply existing. I mean, if you had parents or caregivers who were emotionally unpredictable or who jumped to the worst conclusions about you, you basically had to become a lawyer in your own childhood. You had to learn how to present a rock-solid, completely airtight case for why you spilled the milk, or why you got a B instead of an A, or why you were crying. Actually, in these types of environments, simply saying I made a mistake or I'm sad was never enough. It probably resulted in punishment or getting yelled at. So you learned that in order to avoid the emotional explosion of the adults around you, you had to over-explain everything. You had to provide all the mitigating circumstances, all the context, and all the evidence before they could jump to their own negative conclusions. And, well, when you repeat a survival behavior like that over and over again for years, it wires itself deep into your nervous system. Even when you are an adult and you are totally safe, and you are just talking to a coworker or a friend who actually loves and respects you, your nervous system doesn't always know the difference. The moment there is a slight pause in the conversation, or they reply with a short text like, "K," your brain instantly flashes back to that feeling of being in trouble, and the over-explaining immediately kicks into high gear. Furthermore, this behavior is heavily tied to what psychologists call the fawn trauma response. We talk a lot about fight, flight, or freeze, right? But fawning is like the lesser-known fourth response. Fawning is essentially people-pleasing as a trauma response. It's when you subconsciously try to appease a perceived threat by abandoning your own needs and doing whatever you can to make the other person happy or comfortable. And over-explaining is a huge, huge part of the fawn response. When you are over-communicating, you are basically trying to manage the other person's emotions for them. I mean, you are twisting yourself into a pretzel, using a million words to try and make sure they don't feel disappointed, angry, or rejected by you. You take on the entirely impossible burden of controlling how another human being feels, and that is exactly what makes the chronic need to explain yourself so incredibly exhausting. You are doing the emotional labor for two people. Let's also talk about the cognitive load of all this, because wow, it is immense. I mean, imagine the amount of mental energy it takes to constantly pre-screen every single word that comes out of your mouth. Over-analyzers don't just speak. They draft, edit, and proofread their sentences in their heads before they even open their mouths. And then, right after they speak, the post-conversation analysis begins. You know the feeling, right? You walk away from a chat and suddenly your brain starts replaying the tape. Why did I say it like that? Did my joke land wrong? Wait, did they think I was being passive-aggressive when I said no worries? This constant rumination is just draining. It leaves you feeling completely depleted because your brain is running a background app that is using up like 90% of your mental battery. You are expending so much energy trying to perfectly curate other people's perceptions of you, which, ironically, is something you actually have zero control over in the end. Because, well, here is the really hard truth that overanalyzers eventually have to face. Over-communicating doesn't actually guarantee that you will be understood. I know, it sounds completely counterintuitive. You would think that more information naturally leads to more clarity, right? But it actually doesn't. Sometimes over-explaining just muddies the waters even more. When you throw a giant wall of words at someone, the main point usually gets totally lost in all the noise. Instead of hearing your boundary or your genuine thought, the other person just hears anxiety, defensiveness, or a lack of confidence. They might even start to feel suspicious, like, why is this person trying so hard to convince me of this? What are they hiding? So in this really cruel twist of irony, the very tool you are using to try and prevent being misunderstood is often the exact thing that causes the misunderstanding in the first place. You end up creating the exact situation you were so desperately trying to avoid. And on top of that, chronically over-explaining actually chips away at your own self-trust. When you feel the need to justify your choices to everyone around you, you are subconsciously sending a message to your own brain that your decisions aren't valid unless they are approved by a jury of your peers. I mean, you start to believe that your no isn't a full sentence unless it has a socially acceptable excuse attached to it. You start to feel like your needs are inherently burdensome, and that you have to apologize for simply taking up space. It's like you are constantly asking the world for permission to be yourself. And, when you live like that, you give away all of your personal power. You place the remote control to your self-esteem directly into the hands of whoever you happen to be talking to, just waiting to see if they will validate your explanation or reject it. So we really have to look at this fear of being misunderstood with a lot of compassion. It's not a flaw in your character. It is a brilliantly designed psychological defense mechanism that kept you safe at some point in your life. It worked when you needed it to. But like all outdated survival mechanisms, it eventually starts to hold you back when you try to carry it into environments where you are actually safe. It keeps you trapped in this perpetual loop of anxiety and overcompensation. And honestly, acknowledging that this is happening is the very first and most crucial step in breaking the cycle. You have to start noticing the physical sensation that arises right before you launch into a massive explanation. It's usually a tightness in the chest, a fluttering in the stomach, or this urgent, overwhelming pressure to fill the silence. Recognizing that feeling and realizing that it is just a ghost from the past telling you that you are in danger when you aren't is absolutely huge. So when you actually start to think about how to stop this whole exhausting cycle, you basically have to begin by radically shifting your entire mindset, I mean, for your entire life, you have probably operated under the assumption that you inherently owe everyone around you an explanation for, everything you do. But honestly, you just don't. You really don't. It is incredibly difficult to accept, but your choices, your boundaries, and your feelings are entirely valid all on their own, completely independent of anyone else's approval or understanding. When you catch yourself literally about to launch into a massive, breathless defense of why you cannot attend a Friday night dinner, you have to just pause and ask yourself, wait, why do I feel like I am on trial here? Because, well, you aren't on trial. Actually, stepping out of the courtroom that you have basically built in your own mind is the very first step toward finding some real peace. You have to actively choose to step down from the witness stand and realize that your life is your own. And this brings us to one of the most terrifying yet utterly liberating concepts in the entire world of psychology and boundary setting. The idea that no is actually a complete sentence. I mean, just let that sink in for a second, right? No. Period. No commas, no trailing off, no trailing excuses about how busy you are or how tired you feel. Just no. Now, if you are a chronic over-explainer, saying just the word no probably feels like you are dropping an emotional bomb on someone. It feels deeply, fundamentally wrong, like you are being incredibly aggressive or profoundly rude. But you see, that is just your traumatized nervous system talking. It is basically screaming at you to soften the blows so that the other person doesn't turn against you. However, the reality is that healthy people, people who actually respect you, do not need a 20-minute PowerPoint presentation to accept your boundary. They just say, "Okay, no problem," and they move on with their day. The intense panic you feel is entirely internal, you know? So, a really practical tool to help you navigate this whole terrifying transition is learning to recognize and avoid something psychologists call JADE. JADE stands for justify, argue, defend, and explain. Basically, whenever you find yourself doing any of those four things in a relatively normal, low-stakes situation, you are probably over-communicating out of fear. I mean, think about it. You do not need to justify why you want to stay home and read a book instead of going out. You do not need to argue about why you prefer a certain method at work. You definitely don't need to defend your dietary choices, and you do not need to constantly explain your harmless personal preferences. When you completely stop JADE-ing, you essentially stop feeding the dynamic that keeps you trapped in anxiety. It is like taking away the fuel from the fire. At first, withholding all those justifications is going to feel incredibly uncomfortable, almost physically painful. But, well, that discomfort is just the feeling of you finally breaking an old, deeply ingrained habit. But honestly, the hardest part of all this isn't just biting your tongue and stopping the words from coming out. No, the absolute hardest part is actually learning to tolerate being misunderstood. This is basically the boss level challenge for any overanalyzer, you know? Because let's just be completely real for a second. No matter how clear you are, no matter how carefully you choose your words, someone, somewhere, is eventually going to misunderstand you. They're going to project their own insecurities onto you, they're going to misread your tone, or they're just going to flat out jump to the wrong conclusion. And you know what? That has absolutely nothing to do with you. I mean, it is entirely about them and their own psychological lens. You have to finally accept that you simply cannot control other people's perceptions. Trying to control how someone else views you is like trying to catch the wind with your bare hands. It is basically impossible, and it will only ever leave you feeling exhausted and entirely defeated. And, you know, when that inevitable misunderstanding actually happens, your instinct is going to be to immediately rush in and fix it. You are going to want to send that follow-up text, you know, the one that starts with, "Hey, just to be super clear, what I actually meant was..." But this is the exact moment where you have to gently retrain your nervous system. You have to practice just sitting with the profound discomfort of the silence. It is about allowing the other person to maybe be a little bit confused, or even a little bit mildly disappointed, without rushing in to rescue them from those feelings. I mean, other people are allowed to have their reactions, and you are entirely allowed to not be responsible for managing them. When you actually sit in that silence and realize that the world hasn't ended, that the sky hasn't fallen down just because someone didn't fully grasp your intentions, you start to rewire your brain for actual, genuine safety. You prove to yourself that you are okay. Furthermore, as you slowly start to stop over-explaining to the outside world, something really beautiful and quite profound starts to happen internally. You actually begin to rebuild your own self-trust. I mean, for years, you have probably outsourced your self-esteem, essentially waiting for other people to nod and validate your perfectly crafted excuses before you allowed yourself to feel okay about your decisions. But when you simply state a boundary and just leave it at that, you are basically telling your own subconscious, "Hey, my feelings are totally valid, and I completely trust my own judgment." You basically stop acting like a child who constantly needs to hand in a permission slip to the adults in the room. You step into your own adult power. And, well, this radical self-trust naturally radiates outward. Ironically, people actually start to respect you more when you speak less. They sense that quiet, grounded confidence. They start to realize that your words carry real weight precisely because you aren't desperately throwing them around trying to win everyone's immediate approval. So, honestly, the journey to breaking the chronic need to explain yourself is really not about becoming cold or distant or uncaring. It is definitely not about shutting down communication completely. I mean, healthy communication is absolutely vital for any good relationship, but there is a massive, incredibly important difference between sharing your heart with someone who actually creates a safe space for you and frantically defending your basic existence to someone who simply refuses to understand you. You basically have to learn how to discern between the two. Save your beautiful, deep, complex explanations for the people who truly earn the right to hear them, you know? Keep them for the people who listen to understand, rather than the people who just listen to judge. For everyone else, simple, direct, polite brevity is completely enough. It really is. It is going to take time, and you will definitely mess up and over-explain sometimes, and that is totally okay. Just, be gentle with yourself. You are unlearning a lifetime of survival tactics. And, practically speaking, you can actually start practicing this today with small everyday interactions. Like, try drafting a text message response that is completely free of apologies or unnecessary context. Instead of typing, "I am so sorry, but I actually can't make it to lunch today because I have this massive deadline and my dog is sick and I barely slept," just try sending, "I won't be able to make it to lunch today, but I hope you have a great time." Stare at that shorter message for a minute before you hit send. Notice the panic rising in your chest, but hit send anyway. Let the uncomfortable feelings wash over you and then, well, watch what happens. Usually, absolutely nothing bad happens. They reply with a quick thumbs up, and the world just keeps turning. These tiny, low-stakes experiments are basically how you gradually build up your tolerance for simply stating a fact without layering a mountain of defensive padding on top of it. Ultimately, finding your voice again is truly a beautiful process of self-discovery, It is like you are finally peeling back all those heavy, exhausting layers of anxiety and fear that have been holding you down for so long. When you stop chronically explaining yourself, you actually create this wonderful, quiet space in your mind. You finally have the mental energy to focus on what you actually want and need. Instead of constantly obsessing over what everyone else might be thinking about you, you start to realize that your peace of mind is vastly more important than being perfectly understood by every single person you interact with. And, well, that realization is basically the ultimate form of freedom. You get to just live your life authentically and unapologetically without constantly reading from a script. So the next time you feel that familiar urge to over-communicate, just take a deep breath, smile, and remember that you are already completely enough, exactly as you are right now. Have you ever sat across from someone you've known for years, maybe even a decade, and suddenly realized that you literally have nothing left to talk about? You're just sitting there, staring at your coffee, desperately trying to pull a conversation out of thin air, and it just feels heavy. Well, if you're watching this, you probably know exactly what I mean. You haven't had a falling out, nobody betrayed anyone, there was no massive dramatic argument, but the distance between the two of you feels like an absolute canyon. And honestly, it's completely exhausting. This is the unspoken reality of outgrowing your friends. It's direct, it's painful, and frankly, it is one of the most guilt-inducing experiences of human adulthood. But here is the truth right up front. You are not a bad person for outgrowing people. You are simply experiencing what psychologists refer to as divergent intellectual evolution. And today, we really need to talk about why this happens to you faster than it seems to happen to everyone else around you. Think about how we actually make friends in the beginning. Like when we are kids or teenagers, our friendships are almost entirely based on proximity and convenience. You sat next to them in middle school math class, or maybe your lockers were next to each other, or you both happened to live on the same street. That was literally the foundational criteria for your bond. We basically bonded over shared environments and shared complaints, right? We complained about the same teachers, we liked the same video games, or we just happened to be on the same soccer team. But the thing is, as you age, the metric for genuine connection fundamentally shifts. It moves away from geographical proximity and shifts heavily towards psychological alignment. And this is where the friction starts. Because while your geography can stay the same, your psychology is, well, it's supposed to change. But the uncomfortable truth is that not everyone's psychology changes at the exact same rate. In fact, some people actively fight against that change. So let's talk about what intellectual evolution actually means in this context. Because I want to be super clear here. I'm not talking about IQ, I'm not talking about who has a master's degree or who reads the most classic literature. That's just academic posturing. When we talk about psychological and intellectual evolution in friendships, we are talking about curiosity. We are talking about emotional elasticity and what psychologists call openness to experience. You see, openness to experience is actually one of the big 5 personality traits, and it essentially measures your willingness to engage with new ideas, reconsider your own deeply held beliefs, and basically step outside of your comfortable little echo chamber. Well, as it turns out, some people have a massive driving hunger for this. They are constantly consuming new perspectives, reflecting on their own flaws, and trying to understand the mechanics of the world around them. And then, there are others who hit a certain age, usually somewhere in their early to mid-20s, and they just stop. They cement their worldview. They lock the doors, close the windows, and decide, okay, this is who I am, and this is how the world works, forever. And honestly, it makes sense from a biological perspective. Our brains are incredibly energy-hungry organs. They consume about 20% of the body's energy, right? So the brain's default setting is actually to conserve energy whenever possible. Learning new things, challenging your own biases, actively working to evolve your mindset, all of that requires a massive amount of cognitive calories. It is genuinely hard work. So when your friend decides they'd rather just talk about the same old drama or complain about the same job they've hated for 5 years without actually doing anything about it, they aren't necessarily trying to be toxic. Their brain is just taking the path of least resistance. It's seeking comfort. But if you are someone who is naturally wired for growth, if you are constantly pushing your own boundaries, that comfort zone feels like a cage to you. And you start to feel it in the conversations first. Actually, the shift in conversation is always the biggest red flag. There is a very famous quote, usually attributed to Eleanor Roosevelt, that goes something like, "Great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, small minds discuss people." Now, whether she actually said it or not, the psychology behind it is incredibly accurate. When you are evolving intellectually, you naturally want to discuss concepts. You want to talk about the future, about psychology, about philosophy, about business ideas, or just the underlying mechanics of why people do what they do. You want to dissect the world. But when you try to bring these topics to a friend who has essentially stagnated, what happens? I mean, you've probably seen it. Their eyes sort of glaze over. They give you a generic, "Oh wow, yeah, that's crazy." And then they immediately pivot the conversation back to gossip, or back to reminiscing about that one thing you guys did together 7 years ago. And listen, reminiscing is fine. Nostalgia is great in small doses. But when your entire friendship is held together by the glue of the past, you are basically just maintaining a museum. You aren't building a future together. You're just visiting a memorial of who you both used to be. And that is incredibly lonely. It's almost lonelier than actually being alone, right? Because you are sitting right next to them. But intellectually, you are on completely different planets. You are projecting yourself into the future, actively trying to figure out how to optimize your life, your mental health, your career. And they are perpetually stuck on replay. And the moment you realize this, the guilt hits you like a ton of bricks. You think, wow, am I a snob? Am I being arrogant for wanting more out of this interaction? But the reality is, you aren't being arrogant at all. You are just starving for intellectual resonance. The real danger, though, is how the stagnating friend reacts to your evolution. Because, people aren't blind. Even if they don't have the vocabulary to articulate it, your friends can feel you pulling away. They can sense that your mindset is shifting. And very often, your personal growth triggers their deepest insecurities. When you start setting boundaries, or when you stop engaging in petty gossip, or when you start dedicating your weekends to learning a new skill instead of just drinking at the same bar you've all gone to for a decade, well, your choices hold up a mirror to their stagnation. And a lot of people absolutely hate what they see in that mirror. So instead of being inspired by your growth, they try to pull you back down. It's that classic crabs in a bucket mentality, right? If one crab tries to climb out and escape, the others will literally reach up and drag it back down into the pile. You see this all the time in long-term friendships. They'll say things like, "Oh, you've changed," or "You're taking life too seriously," or "You think you're better than us now." And I mean, that hurts. It really does. It makes you second-guess your entire journey. You start to wonder if maybe you should just shrink yourself back down to make them comfortable. Maybe you should just play small, laugh at the jokes you don't find funny anymore, and pretend that you still care about the trivial drama that consumes their lives. But if you do that, you are committing intellectual suicide. You are intentionally stunting your own psychological growth just to keep the peace. And frankly, any friendship that requires you to actively shrink your mind in order to maintain it is not a friendship anymore. It's a hostage situation disguised as loyalty. So why does this happen to you faster than others? Well, part of it is neuroplasticity. Some individuals inherently retain a higher degree of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections, well into adulthood. While the majority of the population settles into fixed neural pathways, meaning fixed habits, fixed beliefs, and fixed social circles, you might be someone whose brain constantly craves novel stimuli. You read a book, and it actually shifts your perspective. You have a conversation with a stranger, and it genuinely changes how you view a certain topic. You are permeable to growth. The flip side of this permeability is that you shed your old skin much faster, and sadly that old skin often includes the social dynamics and the friendships that were attached to it. You literally outpace them cognitively. And we really don't talk enough about the grief that comes with this. Outgrowing a friend is a very specific, very agonizing type of mourning, because there is no clean break. When someone dies, there's a funeral. When you go through a romantic breakup, there's usually a clear conversation, a definitive endpoint, and society gives you the space to cry and eat ice cream and process the loss. But when you outgrow a friend, it's just a slow fade. It's a series of unreturned texts. It's a bunch of cancelled plans. It's the gradual realization that you are fundamentally incompatible now, and there is no closure there. You just have to silently carry the ghost of that friendship with you, constantly battling the societal conditioning that tells you friends are forever. But the truth is, most friends are not forever. Psychologists often talk about the concept of seasons in human relationships. People come into your life for a reason, a season, or a lifetime. The problem is that we desperately try to force seasonal friends into lifetime roles. We cling to the history we share with them, completely ignoring the fact that the history is literally the only thing we have left in common. You have to understand that letting go of a friend you've outgrown is actually an act of mutual respect. It respects your need for a stimulating, aligned environment, and honestly, it respects their right to exist comfortably at their own current level of awareness, without you constantly prodding them to change. Because you can't drag someone up a mountain they don't want to climb. I mean, you can try, but you'll both just end up exhausted and resentful. Ultimately, the acceleration of your intellectual evolution is a gift, even if it feels incredibly isolating right now. It means you are awake. It means you are actively participating in the creation of your own character, rather than just passively letting your past dictate your future. You are asking the big, uncomfortable questions. You are refusing to settle for surface-level existence. And yes, the unfortunate collateral damage of that process is that the people who refuse to ask those questions will slowly fade from your periphery. But you have to let them fade. You have to make peace with the fact that evolution requires shedding. You cannot carry the dead weight of incompatible relationships into the next version of your life and expect to thrive. Think about a snake shedding its skin. I know it's a cliché metaphor, but it is deeply scientifically accurate to the human psychological experience. The snake doesn't shed its skin because it hates the skin. It doesn't look at it and say, "Wow, what a terrible skin." It sheds it because if it doesn't, it will literally die. It will be crushed by the confinement of its own past growth. The old skin protected it during a specific phase of its life. It was necessary. It was valuable. But it cannot accommodate the creature it is becoming. Your past friendships are exactly the same. They were necessary. They provided comfort, laughter, and belonging during a time when you desperately needed those exact things. You can honor the absolute beauty of what that friendship was, while simultaneously accepting the harsh reality of what it is no longer. So you find yourself in this messy, chaotic, lonely transitional phase. You are standing in the gap between the people you have loved and outgrown, and the people you have yet to meet who will actually match your current intellectual vibration. And I mean, let's be real, this hallway is terrifying. It is quiet, it is echoey, but it is in this exact space of solitude that you actually solidify your new values. If you panic and run back to the familiar comforting arms of the friends you've outgrown just to avoid the loneliness, you essentially reset all of your progress. You have to be willing to sit in the discomfort of outgrowing your environment. You have to trust that by clearing out the social clutter of misaligned connections, you are actually creating the necessary vacuum to attract people who don't just tolerate your growth, but who actually demand it from you. So you find yourself standing in that hallway. And I mean, let's just be completely honest with ourselves for a second here. The silence of that transitional hallway is absolutely deafening. You know, you check your phone on a Friday night and it's just empty. There are no group chats blowing up, no casual invitations to grab a drink at the same place you've been going to for years, and your immediate instinct, the one heavily programmed by basically every movie and television show we have ever consumed, is that something is deeply, fundamentally wrong with you. You sit there and you think, well, if I was actually a good person, or if I was fun to be around, I would have this massive tribe of people around me. But I need you to know that this is a complete illusion. The reality is that the higher you climb on your own personal mountain of self-actualization, the thinner the air naturally gets. And naturally fewer people are equipped to breathe at that altitude. It's not elitism, right? It's just an undeniable psychological fact that intense personal growth naturally and inevitably narrows your social pool. I actually think one of the most toxic concepts modern culture has ever sold us is the idea of the squad. You know what I mean, right? This immense societal pressure to have a huge, perfectly curated group of friends who do absolutely everything together. We see it all over social media, and it makes us feel incredibly inadequate if we don't have it. But neurologically speaking, the human brain isn't even designed to maintain that many deep, intellectually stimulating connections at once. There's actually a well-known concept in psychology called Dunbar's number. Basically, the evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar found that human beings can only realistically maintain about 150 stable social relationships in total. But within that overarching number, the inner circle, the people you actually trust, the ones who intellectually challenge you and deeply emotionally support you, that number is incredibly small. We are talking about maybe 5 people, max. So, when you find yourself naturally shedding all of those superficial connections, you aren't actually losing anything of real substance. You are just aggressively editing your life down to its absolute essentials. And this brings us to a massive paradigm shift that you have to make if you are ever going to survive this evolutionary process with your sanity intact. You have to completely redefine what the actual purpose of a friendship is in your adult life. When we are younger, right? The primary purpose of a friend is just to validate us. We want someone to look at us and say, yes, you are cool, your outfit is great, your opinions are totally correct. We seek out constant validation because our own identities are still incredibly fragile. But as you evolve, and as you build real solid self-esteem, your need for that constant external validation just completely plummets. You simply don't need a friend to tell you that you are okay anymore. What you actually need is a friend to tell you where your blind spots are. You need someone who is going to look at your business plan or your life choices and say, hey, I love you, but I think you are thinking about this entirely the wrong way. You need a sparring partner, not an echo chamber. There is a very common piece of advice floating around in the self-improvement space. If you are the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. And well, it's a cliche for a very good reason. It is absolutely, undeniably true. When you outgrow your friends, you have essentially become the smartest, or at least the most consciously evolved, person in your particular social room. And the danger there isn't just that you get bored. The real, insidious danger is intellectual atrophy. Human beings are highly adaptable creatures. We unconsciously mirror the behavior, the vocabulary, and the ambition levels of the people we spend the most time with. It's a psychological phenomenon known as the chameleon effect. So if you choose to stay in a room where everyone else has completely stopped growing, your brain will literally start to dial back its own processing power just to match the baseline of the group. You will inevitably start shrinking your dreams, watering down your vocabulary, and suppressing your natural curiosity just to fit in. You are basically starving your own potential to keep them comfortable. So how do we actually handle the friends we are leaving behind? Because, we don't want to be cruel, we still care about them. And I think the healthiest way to process this transition is to start categorizing your friendships a little differently. You have to learn to separate your historical friends from your resonant friends. Historical friends are the ones you obviously share a deep past with. They are the people who knew you when you had braces, or when you were absolutely broke in college. And you can absolutely still love them. You can check in on them. You can grab a coffee with them twice a year and talk about the good old days and reminisce. But you have to radically adjust your expectations of them. You cannot expect your historical friends to provide your current intellectual stimulation. You just can't. You have to stop being disappointed when they don't want to talk about philosophy or psychology or your new investment strategy. You wouldn't go to a hardware store and be angry that they don't sell milk, right? It's the exact same principle. You have to stop going to historical friends for your resonant needs, which naturally leads to the biggest, most pressing question. How do you actually find these resonant friends? How do you find the people who are evolving at the exact same speed as you are right now? Well, the harsh truth is, you don't find them by accident. You're not going to just stumble into them at your local dive bar on a random Tuesday night. Resonant friends are almost always found at the very edges of your comfort zone. They are found in places that actually require a high barrier to entry. I mean, they are at the seminars you have to pay money to attend. They are in the difficult intensive workshops. They are in the advanced classes, the niche online communities, the places where people are actively, intentionally investing their time and capital into their own growth. If you really want to find people who are dedicated to evolving, you have to physically place yourself in the environments where evolution is actually the mandatory curriculum. But I really have to warn you, stepping into those new high-level environments is incredibly humbling, because when you finally find a room full of people who are growing as fast, or maybe even faster than you are, you suddenly become the small fish again. You go from being the most ambitious person in your old, stagnant friend group to suddenly being the person with the most to learn in your new one. And that requires a massive amount of ego vulnerability. You have to be completely willing to look at someone and say, I don't know, or can you explain that concept to me? You have to be totally okay with looking a little bit foolish while you catch up to their speed. But honestly, that friction, that slight, awkward discomfort of feeling a little out of your depth, that is exactly what real growth feels like. It's exactly like a muscle. If it doesn't burn a little bit, you aren't actually lifting a heavy enough weight to make a difference. And during this entire transitional period, you are absolutely going to be tested. Life has this really funny, almost cruel way of testing your resolve right when you are on the very verge of a major breakthrough. You will be sitting alone on a weekend, feeling that deep, aching loneliness we talked about earlier, and suddenly your old friend group will text you. They will invite you out to the exact same place to have the exact same conversations you've had 100 times, and it will be so incredibly tempting to just say yes, just to feel something familiar, just to temporarily numb the isolation for a few hours. But you have to recognize that moment for what it actually is. It is a test. It is life asking you, are you actually serious about this new version of yourself, or are you just going to retreat to the familiar the second it gets uncomfortable? You have to learn how to self-soothe your own loneliness. You have to learn how to be completely, unapologetically happy in your own company, because mastering solitude is the absolute prerequisite for finding high-level connection. Think about it this way. If you are desperately lonely, you are fundamentally operating from a place of scarcity. And when you operate from a place of scarcity, you will literally accept any scrap of social interaction that comes your way, regardless of how poor the quality is. You become an emotional bargain hunter, But when you actually master your solitude, when you actively fill your own cup with your own hobbies, your own learning, and your own deep work, you shift into a state of abundance. And from that state of abundance, your standards naturally and effortlessly skyrocket. You simply no longer need people to fill a void in your life. You only allow people into your inner circle if they actually enhance the silence. And I mean, that is a wildly powerful place to operate from. When you are genuinely okay with being alone, you become essentially immune to toxic or stagnant relationships. You just walk away, because your baseline of solitude is already so incredibly high quality that you won't disrupt it for just anyone. So, if you are currently navigating this brutal, beautiful, exhausting process of outgrowing the people around you, I desperately need you to completely release the guilt you are carrying. Society tries to brand this holding on as loyalty, constantly telling us we have to stick by people forever no matter what. But true loyalty does not ever require you to abandon yourself. True loyalty is not a suicide pact where you both silently agree to stop growing just so neither of you ever feels insecure. By bravely choosing your own evolution, you are actually giving the people around you a silent permission slip to do the exact same thing. Some of them will take it, and they will eventually rise up to meet you at your new level. The vast majority of them, however, will not. And you have to accept that that is perfectly okay. Their journey is their journey, and your journey is entirely yours. Ultimately, your only actual responsibility in this lifetime is to become the absolute fullest, most realized version of yourself. And if that means you have to temporarily leave some people behind at base camp while you summit the mountain, then that is exactly what you have to do. You know, you cannot apologize for your own expansion. You absolutely cannot shrink your intelligence, your ambition, or your intense curiosity just to make your stagnant environments feel a little bit more comfortable for everyone else. Embrace the hallway. Embrace the silence of the transition. Keep reading, keep learning, keep asking those massive, deeply unanswerable questions. Because eventually the hallway ends, and when it finally does, the doors are going to open to rooms filled with people who have been looking for exactly someone like you. Keep evolving. Keep shedding the old skin, because I promise you, the next version of your life is going to be absolutely extraordinary. You're probably sitting there right now, staring at a screen, wondering why love seems so effortless for everyone else while it feels like an unsolvable puzzle for you. Well, I'll just cut right to the chase. It is not because you are broken, and it is definitely not because you are somehow incapable of being loved. Honestly, it is because your brain is simply doing too much. You see, when you are an overthinker, and especially when you pair that with being a highly observant person, love becomes a battlefield of your own making. You don't just experience a relationship, you literally analyze it, dissect it, and cross-examine it until the joy is completely drained out of it. It's exhausting, isn't it? But understanding exactly why you do this is the very first step to actually stopping the cycle. When we talk about overthinkers trying to find love, we are really talking about people who are desperately trying to control the uncontrollable. You know, love is inherently risky. It requires you to hand over a piece of your heart to someone else and just blindly trust that they won't drop it. But for an overthinker, blind trust is, well, it's basically terrifying. Your mind is hardwired to protect you, so it constantly scans your environment for threats. And when you start dating someone new, your brain basically goes into overdrive. You are not just enjoying the dinner date, you are collecting data. You are analyzing how long it took them to text back, what that slight pause meant before they answered a question, and whether their joke about commitment was actually a joke or a massive glaring red flag. And this is where the highly observant part of your personality actually becomes a double-edged sword. Being observant is usually a great trait, right? It makes you empathetic, it makes you great at your job, and it means you notice the little things that other people completely miss. But in romantic relationships, being highly observant means you see absolutely everything, even the things you really shouldn't be looking at. You notice the microscopic shift in their tone of voice. You see the way their eyes darted away for just a fraction of a second when you brought up the future. You feel the imperceptible change in their energy when they walk into the room. And because you are an overthinker, you don't just notice these things and let them go. Oh no, you take that tiny observation and you build an entire narrative around it. Let's say, for example, your partner comes home from work and they are just a little bit quieter than usual. A normal person, someone who doesn't overthink, might just assume, oh, they had a long day. But you? Well, your brain immediately opens up a massive filing cabinet of every single interaction you've had over the last 72 hours. You start wondering, did I say something wrong this morning? Are they pulling away from me? Is this the beginning of the end? I knew they were getting bored of this relationship. And before they have even taken off their coat, you have basically emotionally prepared yourself for a breakup. It sounds extreme when you say it out loud, but if you are an overthinker, you know exactly how fast that mental spiral happens. It's like 0 to 100 in 3 seconds flat. The tragedy of this, honestly, is that overthinkers have incredibly huge hearts. You want love so badly. You want that deep, meaningful, soul-shaking connection. But you sabotage it because you are so absolutely terrified of being blindsided. You see, to an overthinker, being caught off guard by heartbreak is the ultimate failure. So you try to outsmart it. You try to predict the heartbreak before it happens. You figure, well, if I can see all the angles, if I can anticipate every single way this person might hurt me or let me down, then it won't hurt as much when they actually do it. But the irony is that you end up creating the exact distance and tension that you are so afraid of. You manifest the very rejection you are trying to avoid, simply because you are so busy bracing for impact that you forget to actually participate in the relationship. And let's talk about the exhaustion factor, because being an overthinker in love is genuinely exhausting for you, but, it is also incredibly exhausting for your partner. Imagine being with someone who is constantly putting you on trial in their mind. Even if you never say these thoughts out loud, your partner can feel it. People are intuitive. They can feel when they are being constantly evaluated. They can feel the hesitation in your touch, or the wall you throw up the second things get a little too emotionally intense. Over time, your partner starts to feel like they are constantly walking on eggshells. They feel like they have to carefully measure every single word they say, or every action they take, because they know that you are going to take it, put it under a microscope, and find the absolute worst possible interpretation of it. And honestly, no one can live like that forever. This hypervigilance also completely destroys the spontaneity of romance. Love is supposed to be, at least in part, a little bit reckless. It's about getting caught up in the moment. But how can you be caught up in the moment when a huge percentage of your brain power is busy running risk assessments? You are kissing them, but in the back of your mind, you are analyzing whether they are kissing you with the exact same level of passion as they did 3 weeks ago. You are cuddling on the couch, but you are silently stressing about whether they are actually comfortable or just humoring you. I mean, it is a relentless, suffocating inner monologue that completely robs you of the present moment. You are so obsessed with the future of the relationship, or so stuck analyzing the past, that you are completely missing the right now. Furthermore, highly observant overthinkers struggle immensely with trust, not necessarily because the other person has proven themselves to be untrustworthy, but because the overthinker trusts their own anxiety more than they trust their partner. This is a really crucial point. When you are highly observant, you gather so much information that you start to believe your own interpretations are infallible, absolute truths. You think, well, I saw the way they looked at their phone when it buzzed, so I just know they are hiding something. You confuse your anxiety-driven assumptions with actual intuition, and once you have convinced yourself that your negative narrative is the truth, it is almost impossible for your partner to convince you otherwise. They can reassure you 100 times, but in your mind you're thinking, yeah, but I noticed that micro-expression, so I know the real truth. You essentially build a fortress around yourself, made entirely out of assumptions, and then you sit inside it, feeling lonely, wondering why your partner can't reach you. The hardest part of all this is that it usually stems from a place of deep past trauma or past disappointment. Highly observant people usually develop that trait as a survival mechanism. Somewhere along the line in your life, probably when you were younger, you learnt that the world was unpredictable or unsafe. Maybe you had inconsistent caregivers, or maybe you went through a really brutal betrayal in a past relationship. So you learn to be hyper-aware, you learn to read the room perfectly, to anticipate other people's moods, and to overthink every possible outcome so that you would never be caught off guard again. It kept you safe back then, but the problem is, the exact same defense mechanism that kept you safe in the past is the exact same thing that is keeping you isolated right now. You are wearing armor to a dinner date. And the really wild thing is, you probably attract partners who are initially drawn to how deeply you see them. Because when you are observant, you can make someone feel incredibly understood. You notice the coffee order they prefer, you remember the random story they told you about their childhood. You intuitively know when they need a hug. In the beginning, it feels like magic to them. They think, wow, this person gets me on a level no one else ever has. But as the relationship progresses, that same laser-focused attention turns into a spotlight that they can't escape. What felt like deep emotional intimacy in month 1 starts to feel like intense interrogation by month 6. You go from being the most attentive partner in the world to the most suspicious one, simply because your brain cannot find the off switch. Ultimately, struggling to find and keep love as an overthinker is a battle against your own brilliance. Your mind is sharp, your emotional intelligence is high, and your capacity to observe is unmatched. But you are applying a survival tool to a situation that requires surrender. Love is not a puzzle that you can solve if you just think about it hard enough. It is not a code you can crack. It is messy, it is unpredictable, and yes, it is dangerous to your feelings. But as long as you continue to let your hyper-observant, over-analytical brain drive the car, you are going to keep crashing your relationships before they ever even get the chance to reach their actual destination. So, moving deeper into this whole dynamic, we really have to look at why highly observant people, in particular, struggle so profoundly with trust. I mean, on paper, you would think that being observant makes you better at choosing partners, right? You see the red flags early, you notice the inconsistencies, and basically, you can protect yourself from getting hurt. But honestly, the exact opposite usually happens. When you are hyper-observant, you are constantly gathering so much data that your brain just becomes overwhelmed. And because your mind is fundamentally wired to protect you from pain, it inherently highlights all the negative data while completely ignoring the positive. You know, you could have 99 amazing, consistent, completely loving interactions with your partner, but the second they give you a slightly shorter answer than usual over text, well, your brain completely fixates on that one deviation. You basically convince yourself that this tiny, insignificant moment is the ultimate proof that they are going to betray you. And, you know, this really stems from the curse of pattern recognition. Highly observant people are incredibly good at recognizing patterns in human behavior. I mean, it is literally how you successfully navigate the world. But in a romantic relationship, this becomes a massive problem because you start projecting past patterns onto a completely new person. Let's say your ex used to get really quiet right before they started a terrible argument. Well, now you are with someone entirely new, and they just happen to be quiet because they are tired, or, I don't know, maybe they are just thinking about a movie they watched. But your brain instantly connects the dots, basically yelling that this is the exact same pattern and they are going to start a massive fight and then abandon you. You are, quite literally, reacting to a ghost. You are not actually responding to the person sitting right in front of you. You are reacting to the echoes of people who have already hurt you in the past. Honestly, one of the most dangerous traps you can fall into as a highly observant overthinker is confusing your anxiety with your actual intuition. We hear this advice all the time, right? People always say, trust your gut is never wrong. Well, I hate to break it to you, but when you are trapped in a cycle of overthinking, your gut lies to you all the time. Anxiety is loud, it is urgent, and it demands immediate attention. Intuition, on the other hand, is usually calm and clear. But because you notice every little micro-expression and every tiny shift in energy, your anxiety uses those observations as fuel to start a fire. You start telling yourself that you just know something is wrong, that you can feel it in your bones. But actually, what you are feeling is just your own unresolved fear. You are essentially projecting your own deep insecurities onto your partner and calling it intuition just so you can feel a false sense of control over a scary situation. And because you don't inherently trust that things are just, okay, you end up doing something really destructive without even realizing it. You start secretly testing your partner. I mean, you might pick a small fight just to see if they will stay and resolve it with you. You might completely withdraw your affection, basically going totally cold, just to see if they notice and chase after you. Or maybe you drop these vague, passive-aggressive hints about your insecurities, waiting for them to say the exact right thing to soothe you. It is essentially a constant, exhausting series of invisible hoops that you are making them jump through. But here is the heartbreaking reality about testing people. Even if they pass the test perfectly, the relief you feel is only temporary. 2 days later, your overactive brain will just design a brand new, harder test, because the fundamental lack of trust inside you is still there. Well, what ends up happening is that you create this tragic, self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, nobody wants to feel like they are constantly on trial in their own romantic relationship. When you continually question someone's motives, when you constantly dissect their innocent words, and when you are always waiting for the other shoe to drop, you inevitably create a toxic environment of tension and doubt. Your partner starts to feel like they can literally never do anything right because no matter how much they try to reassure you, your overthinking brain always finds a loophole. Eventually, the emotional weight of constantly trying to prove their loyalty becomes way too much. They start to pull away, not because they didn't genuinely love you, but because they are just completely emotionally exhausted. And then, of course, your brain says, aha, I knew it, I knew they were going to leave. You basically orchestrated the exact abandonment you were so desperately trying to prevent. It all really comes down to this massive illusion of control. As an overthinker, you genuinely believe that if you just analyze every single angle, if you literally mentally rehearse every possible worst-case scenario, you can somehow soften the blow of heartbreak. You think worrying is a form of emotional preparation, but honestly, it isn't. I mean, you cannot outthink pain. If someone is going to break your heart, they're going to break your heart. And no amount of late night agonizing or hyper-analyzing their text messages is going to stop it from happening. All you are actually doing is ruining the present moment. You are sacrificing the joy, the peace, and the deep connection you could be experiencing right now just to protect yourself against a hypothetical future that might not even ever happen. You are essentially paying interest on a debt you do not even owe yet. And, highly observant people often struggle with this desperate, insatiable need for absolute certainty. You just want a guarantee. You want a neon sign from the universe loudly declaring that this person is safe and they will never, ever hurt you. But love simply does not come with guarantees. It is, by its very nature, a massive, terrifying leap of faith into the unknown. When you try to force certainty into a relationship by constantly observing, analyzing, and questioning every single detail, you just end up strangling the life right out of it. Love desperately needs room to breathe. It needs space to be imperfect. Your partner is going to have bad days. They're going to say the wrong thing sometimes, and their energy is absolutely going to fluctuate. And honestly, that doesn't mean the relationship is doomed. It literally just means they are a normal, flawed human being, just like you. So how do you actually stop this painful cycle? How do you turn off this overactive, hypervigilant brain of yours and actually allow yourself to experience a healthy, trusting relationship? Well, the very first step is rigorous self-awareness. You have to start catching yourself in the act of spiraling. When you feel that familiar knot of anxiety tightening in your chest because your partner hasn't texted you back in 3 hours, you need to literally pause and challenge your own thoughts. You have to ask yourself out loud if this is an absolute, undeniable fact, or if it is just your anxiety writing a fictional horror story again. You have to start separating the raw, objective data of what actually happened from the terrifying narrative your brain is desperately trying to spin around it. You really have to realize that you are often the author of your own panic. And then, you have to actively practice grounding yourself in the reality of the present moment. When your brain tries to wildly drag you into the past to remind you of how your ex betrayed you, or when it tries to hurl you into the future to imagine your current partner packing their bags, you have to firmly pull yourself back to the right now. What is actually happening in this exact specific second? Is your partner sitting next to you on the couch? Are they holding your hand? Are you safe in this specific room? Because honestly, the present moment is the only place where true, authentic connection actually exists. You simply cannot bond with someone if you are mentally living 5 years in the past or 10 steps in the future. You have to force yourself, as hard and uncomfortable as it is, to just be here, right now, experiencing the relationship as it unfolds naturally. Communication is obviously key, but for an overthinker, it is entirely about learning how to communicate your fears without making them sound like character assassinations. Instead of saying something aggressive like, "You're acting distant, what are you hiding from me?" which instantly puts them on the defensive, you can try saying something softer like, "Honestly, my anxiety is acting up today, and I am feeling a little bit insecure. I could really use some reassurance right now." Do you see the difference there? One approach makes them the enemy you have to fight, while the other approach invites them in to be your teammate. When you finally own your overthinking and present it as a personal vulnerability rather than a completely proven fact about their bad behavior, a healthy partner will actually step up and comfort you. They will appreciate your honesty, and it will build real trust instead of tearing it down. Another wildly crucial step is actively learning to give people the benefit of the doubt. This is ridiculously hard for highly observant people because you are so incredibly used to assuming the worst-case scenario. But you absolutely have to start retraining your brain. When your partner does something that lightly triggers your anxiety, instead of instantly jumping to the most catastrophic conclusion, force yourself to come up with 3 perfectly innocent, boring explanations for their behavior. Maybe they really are just swamped at work. Maybe they actually just completely forgot to mention that small detail. Maybe they are just physically tired. By forcing yourself to acknowledge these mundane, completely innocent possibilities, you slowly start to dismantle the absolute dictatorial authority of your anxious thoughts. You basically teach your brain that there are actually multiple ways to interpret a situation, and the scary one isn't always the correct one. Ultimately, overcoming this lifelong struggle requires you to deeply and fundamentally accept the inherent, unavoidable risk of love. You have to bravely accept that yes, you might get hurt again. They might genuinely let you down. Things might honestly not work out in the end. But you also have to realize that avoiding the possibility of pain also completely guarantees that you will completely avoid the experience of deep, profound love. You are literally locking yourself inside a dark, safe room to avoid the storm, but you are also completely missing out on the warmth of the sunshine. Being highly observant is a beautiful, rare gift. It means you can understand and love someone with a depth and an attention to detail that is incredibly special. But you have to willingly take off the heavy armor. You have to stop using your own brilliance as a shield to keep people away. So, just take a deep breath. Stop trying to outsmart your own heart. I know it is absolutely terrifying to relinquish control, to just let things be exactly what they are without analyzing them to death. But honestly, the love you are desperately looking for, the true, lasting, deeply secure love, it only exists on the other side of that surrender. You have to trust yourself enough to know that even if the absolute worst happens, even if you are totally blindsided and heartbroken, you will eventually be okay. You have already survived every single bad day you have ever had in your life. So, let go of the magnifying glass. Stop turning your romantic relationship into a crime scene investigation. Just generously allow yourself to be loved completely and foolishly and bravely. Because at the end of the day, a love that is constantly analyzed is never actually felt. And you absolutely, without a doubt, deserve to finally feel it. Look, let's just be completely honest here for a second. You want love. You crave it. Deep down, you fundamentally and desperately want someone to just look at you, really see you, and choose you. And here's the really confusing part. The actual second someone starts getting close, like truly close, you push them away, you panic, you suddenly find a flaw, you start an argument out of absolutely nowhere, or you just kind of quietly fade out of their life. It makes absolutely no sense, right? I mean, why on earth would we actively run away from the exact thing we spend our entire lives searching for? Well, actually, there is a name for this, and it is incredibly common. It's called the intimacy paradox. And today we are going to look at why you, and honestly so many of us, are absolutely terrified of the one thing we want the most. So, to really understand this, we kind of have to take a step back and look at how human beings are wired. Basically, from an evolutionary standpoint, we are pack animals. We are biologically designed for connection. I mean, thousands of years ago, if you were separated from your tribe, you literally wouldn't survive. So this desire for connection, this craving to be loved and held and understood, it isn't just some romantic ideal you picked up from watching too many movies. It is, quite literally, a survival instinct. Your brain is essentially screaming at you, find your people, bond with them, stay safe. But here is where the paradox really starts to kick in. Because while your biology is demanding connection, your psychology, your individual, lived experience, might be actively associating that exact same connection with danger. We throw the word intimacy around a lot, but I want you to really think about what it actually means. Some psychologists break the word down into the phrase intimacy. Intimacy isn't just about holding hands or sharing a bed. It is fundamentally about visibility. It is the act of letting another human being look past the carefully constructed version of yourself that you present to the world and letting them see the raw, unedited, entirely vulnerable reality of who you are. And honestly, that is terrifying. It is profoundly scary. Because if you let someone see all the way into you, if you let them see your insecurities, your weird habits, your past mistakes, your deepest fears, you are essentially handing them a loaded weapon. You are giving them all the information they would ever need to completely destroy you. I mean, think about it like this. Most of us walk around wearing some sort of mask, right? We have the competent professional mask, the funny friend mask, the chill, easygoing partner mask. And these masks are incredibly useful. They keep us safe. They help us navigate the world without getting hurt. But when you meet someone and you start to develop real, genuine feelings for them, that mask naturally starts to slip. It has to, because you can't build deep intimacy with a piece of plastic. You can only build it with a real face. But the moment that mask slips, a sort of alarm bell goes off in your brain. Your brain essentially goes, wait, stop, what are you doing? If they see the real us, they aren't going to like it. They're going to leave. And so, To protect yourself from the hypothetical pain of them leaving later, you just decide to push them away right now. This deep-seated fear of being truly known is almost always rooted in shame. Shame is basically this insidious, quiet little voice that tells us we are fundamentally flawed. It's not guilt. Guilt is I did something bad. Shame is I am bad. And if you carry around any amount of shame, which, let's be real, basically all of us do to some degree, the prospect of intimacy feels less like a warm hug and more like an impending interrogation. You start to feel like you are a fraud, just waiting to be found out. You think, sure, they like me right now, but that's only because they don't know the whole story. Once they realize how messy or needy or broken I actually am, they're going to run. So, what do? You subconsciously decide to beat them to the punch. And, the way we push people away isn't always super obvious. It's not like you just wake up one day and scream, I am terrified of vulnerability, so I am leaving you. No, it's usually much more subtle, and honestly, a lot more confusing. Psychologists call these deactivating strategies. Essentially, these are little mental tricks your brain plays to turn off your attachment system when it starts to feel too overwhelmed. For example, maybe you meet someone great, but suddenly you become hyper-fixated on the way they chew their food, or the fact that they don't like your favorite band, or the way they laugh. Like, literally overnight, these tiny, insignificant details become massive, unforgivable deal breakers. You convince yourself, well, obviously this isn't the right person for me. I mean, look at how annoying they are. But in reality, it's just your fear looking for an escape hatch. Another classic way this shows up is through what we might call the Phantom X phenomenon, or holding out for an utterly impossible standard of perfection. Basically, you keep yourself emotionally unavailable to the actual, real-life human beings right in front of you by obsessing over someone from your past, or by comparing everyone to a completely idealized, flawless fantasy partner that literally doesn't exist. It's a brilliant defense mechanism if you really think about it. By keeping your heart locked away for someone who is either gone or imaginary, you never actually have to risk being vulnerable with someone who is present. You get to keep longing for love without ever having to do the messy, risky work of actually participating in it. I mean, it is so exhausting, isn't it? This constant push and pull. You feel incredibly lonely, so you reach out, you go on a date, you open up, you let someone in, and for a second it feels amazing. You feel seen. But then, almost immediately, the vulnerability hangover hits. The walls slam back down. You start taking longer to text back. You suddenly become really busy with work. You pick a fight over nothing just to create some emotional distance. And the tragedy of this cycle is that the other person is usually left feeling completely bewildered and deeply hurt. They thought things were going great, and suddenly they are being shut out in the cold. And when they inevitably step back or give up, your brain sort of twists the narrative to validate your original fear. You tell yourself, see, I knew they wouldn't stick around. I knew people always leave. When, in reality, you actively orchestrated the very abandonment you were so afraid of. A lot of this stems from early childhood experiences and our attachment styles. If you grew up in an environment where your emotions were ignored, where love felt conditional, or where you were criticized for being too much or too sensitive, your brain learned a very specific painful lesson. It learned that being authentic leads to rejection. It learned that being vulnerable is literally unsafe. So you adapted. You built a fortress around your heart. And as a kid, that fortress was a brilliantly adaptive survival strategy. It kept you safe in an environment that didn't know how to hold your emotions. But now, as an adult, that exact same fortress is the very thing keeping you trapped in a cycle of isolation. You are essentially using outdated software to run your current relationships. And the really heartbreaking part is that you can't selectively numb your feelings. You can't just build a wall to keep out the pain, the rejection, and the fear, without simultaneously blocking out the joy, the deep connection, and the profound sense of belonging that you actually crave. It's basically a package deal. When you refuse to let people see the dark, messy parts of you, you also rob them of the chance to love the dark, messy parts of you. And let me tell you, there is absolutely no feeling in the world quite like having someone look directly at the things you hate most about yourself, the things you are deeply ashamed of, and having them say, I see that, and I love you anyway. But you can never, ever experience that kind of healing if you are too afraid to even let them look in the first place. So we find ourselves stuck in this painful, frustrating limbo. We are standing right on the edge of the water, dying of thirst, but absolutely terrified to take a drink because we are convinced the water is poisoned. We want to be loved, but we believe that if we are truly known, we will be unlovable. It is a profound inner conflict that can ruin perfectly good relationships, sabotage amazing opportunities for connection, and leave us feeling chronically misunderstood and utterly alone, even when we are surrounded by people. But recognizing this pattern, really truly seeing what you are doing, and more importantly, why you are doing it, is the absolute necessary first step to breaking out of it. Because once you realize that your desire to push people away isn't a sign that they are wrong for you, but rather a sign that your own deep-seated fears are being triggered, well, that changes literally everything. But I want to promise you something. The absolute, undeniable payoff for doing this hard, terrifying work is a life that is so much richer, so much deeper, and so much more vibrant than anything you can experience behind those walls. When you finally stop pushing people away, when you finally let someone look all the way into the darkest, most hidden corners of your soul, and they decide to pitch a tent and stay, it heals something so fundamental inside of you. It completely shatters the lie of shame. So, basically, once you actually see this pattern playing out in your life, you are naturally going to ask, okay, well, how do I stop? How do I actually let someone in without absolutely panicking? And honestly, the very first thing you have to do is just take a massive deep breath and give yourself a little bit of grace. Seriously, I mean it. You have to understand that your brain was just trying to protect you. Those thick, heavy walls you built, they weren't born out of malice, and you aren't broken for having them. They were born out of a profound, desperate need for emotional survival. So instead of being angry at yourself for pushing people away, you kind of need to start by thanking your defense mechanisms for keeping you safe when you needed them. And then gently, letting them know that they can retire now. You are an adult and you can handle the perceived threat. You see, a lot of people think that to overcome the fear of intimacy, they have to just suddenly rip their heart open and share every single dark, traumatic secret on the very first date. And please do not do that. That is terrifying, and it's a recipe for a massive vulnerability hangover. In psychology, there is this incredible concept called titration. It is basically the practice of taking things in very small, manageable, bite-sized pieces. It means that instead of knocking down the entire fortress wall all at once, you literally just, crack a window. You share one small, slightly embarrassing story. You admit to one minor flaw. You let someone see you without makeup, or you tell them you're having a really bad day instead of just automatically saying, "I'm fine." You take a tiny risk, and then you wait and see what happens. And here is the really magical part about taking those tiny calculated risks. When you crack that window and you show a tiny piece of your real self, and the other person doesn't run away screaming, it literally begins to rewire your brain. I mean, fundamentally, it creates a brand new neural pathway. Your brain says, oh wait, we showed them a flaw, and they are actually still here. We didn't die. The world didn't end. And that tiny little drop of positive reinforcement gives you the courage to maybe open the door just to crack the next time. It is a slow, gradual process of teaching your nervous system that connection does not automatically equal destruction. You are essentially retraining your biological responses to recognize that safety can actually exist within another human being. But of course, the panic is still going to rise up, like it just is. You're going to be sitting on the couch with someone you really like, things will feel too good, too close. And suddenly that familiar urge to run away is going to hit you like a freight train. When that happens, one of the most powerful things you can absolutely ever do is just, name the fear out loud. It sounds so completely counterintuitive, right? But honestly, saying something like, hey, I just want you to know, I am really starting to care about you. And to be completely honest, that absolutely terrifies me. And my instinct right now is to pull away, is incredibly disarming. It takes the monster out of the dark closet and puts it right in the middle of the room where both of you can actually look at it. I mean, think about how much confusion and heartache that simple, honest statement prevents. Instead of suddenly acting cold and distant, leaving the other person to agonizingly wonder what on earth they did wrong, you are actively bringing them into your inner world. You are basically handing them a map to your trauma. And a truly safe, loving partner, they aren't going to use that map to hurt you. They're going to look at it and say, okay, I understand. Thank you for telling me. We can take this as slowly as you need. By confessing your fear of intimacy, you are paradoxically creating one of the most profoundly intimate moments you could possibly share with another human being. You are using your fear as a bridge rather than a barricade. Now, to really make this work, you also have to fundamentally change the way you talk to yourself when you're alone. We all have that relentless inner critic, that mean, nagging voice that constantly reminds you of every stupid thing you have ever said, every mistake you have ever made, and every physical flaw you possess. When you fear being truly known, it is usually because you are completely convinced that your inner critic is telling the absolute objective truth. You believe that if anyone else saw what that voice sees, they would be utterly repulsed. So you have to actively start arguing with that voice. You have to recognize that your shame is lying to you. Your flaws do not make you unlovable, they just make you incredibly, delightfully, normally human. Actually, if you really take a step back and look at the people you love the most in your own life, do you love them because they are absolutely perfect? Of course not. That would be completely exhausting. You probably love them precisely because of their weird, quirky little imperfections. You love your best friend's loud, obnoxious laugh. You love the way your sibling gets overly passionate about silly things. You feel connected to them because of their humanity, not their perfection. Well, you have to start realizing that the exact same rule applies to you. The very things you are desperately trying to hide, your quirks, your anxieties, your messy emotions, are often the exact hooks that allow other people to genuinely connect with you. Perfection is slick. There is nothing for anyone to hold on to. Vulnerability has real texture. And look, I really need to be super clear about something here because this is so important. Not everyone actually deserves full access to your vulnerability. I cannot stress this enough. The goal here is not to just walk around completely emotionally naked in front of strangers, or to pour your heart out to people who have repeatedly shown you that they are emotionally unsafe, critical, or dismissive. Overcoming the intimacy paradox requires profound discernment. It means learning to pay very close attention to how people respond when you offer them a small piece of your authentic self. Do they lean in? Do they listen? Do they validate your feelings? Or do they mock you, change the subject, or use it against you later? You are allowed and honestly encouraged to keep your walls up around unsafe people. The trick is simply learning how to lower them for the right ones. Let's talk about the aftermath, though. Because even when you choose the right person, and even when you take it slowly, you are still going to experience what psychologists brilliantly call a vulnerability hangover. It's that awful, sinking feeling you get the morning after you opened up to someone, where your brain just spirals and screams, "Oh my God, why did I say that? I shared way too much. They think I'm a complete idiot." It is literally an emotional withdrawal symptom. Your nervous system is basically freaking out because it left its comfort zone. When this happens, and it absolutely will happen, you just have to ride it out. You have to literally sit on your hands and stop yourself from sending a text that tries to take it all back or downplay what you said. Just breathe through the discomfort. It passes, I promise you, it always passes. And for those of you who are constantly comparing real, breathing humans to some idealized Phantom X or a completely impossible standard of perfection, you really have to start calling yourself out on that behavior. You have to recognize that you are using an illusion to actively sabotage your reality. Real love, honest-to-goodness human connection is never going to look like a perfectly scripted movie. It is going to be messy. It is going to be awkward sometimes. People are going to occasionally say the wrong thing, they are going to misunderstand you, and they are going to annoy you. That isn't a sign that the relationship is doomed. It is literally just a sign that you are dating a real, flawed human being. You have to trade the safety of your flawless fantasy for the beautiful, terrifying messiness of reality. Because honestly, intimacy is not a destination. It really isn't. You don't just suddenly arrive at a place where you are perfectly vulnerable and you never ever feel scared again. Intimacy is a daily, sometimes hourly, choice. It is the conscious decision, made over and over again, to stay in the room when your instincts are screaming at you to run away. It is looking across the dinner table at your partner when you are feeling insecure and instead of picking a fight about the dishes saying, "I am feeling really disconnected from you right now and I just need a hug." It is choosing in 1,000 tiny, seemingly insignificant moments to let yourself be seen. And yes, it is exhausting sometimes, and yes, it is incredibly brave. You realize, maybe for the very first time in your entire life, that you do not have to hustle for your worthiness. You don't have to perform. You don't have to pretend. You just get to exist. So the next time you feel that sudden, overwhelming urge to pull away from someone who is getting a little too close, I want you to just pause, just for 1 second. Notice the panic, acknowledge the fear. But then I want you to ask yourself a really hard question. Am I running away because this person is actually wrong for me? Or am I running away because they are getting close enough to see the real me? Choose to take the risk. Crack the window. Let the light in. Because the deep, profound, soul-shaking connection you are so desperately craving, it is sitting right there, waiting patiently on the exact opposite side of your fear. You just have to be willing to finally, truly let yourself be known. You're in the middle of the ocean, right? Your lungs are absolutely burning. The waves are crashing over your head. And there is a boat just a few yards away from you. People are on it. They have life preservers. They're looking around. But instead of waving your arms and yelling for help, you just, tread water harder. You tell yourself, well, I don't want to inconvenience them. I mean, I got myself into this deep water, so I should really be able to get myself out. It sounds completely insane when you picture it like that, doesn't it? But honestly, if you are a deep thinker, this is probably exactly how you live your emotional life every single day. You would literally rather drown in silence than ask someone to throw you a rope. So, let's talk about why you do this. Society loves to praise independence, right? We are constantly told to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, to be self-sufficient, to be our own boss, and to never rely on anyone. And, up to a certain point, independence is a highly functional, highly necessary trait. But there is a very distinct line between healthy independence and what we are talking about today, which is hyper-independence. Hyper-independence is not a personality quirk, and it is certainly not a superpower, even though it kind of looks like one from the outside. Actually, it is a trauma response. It is a deeply ingrained survival mechanism that you developed because at some point in your life, you learned a very painful lesson, that relying on other people is fundamentally unsafe. When we talk about deep thinkers specifically, this gets incredibly complicated. If you are someone who is highly analytical, the kind of person who lives entirely inside their own head, you probably use your intellect as a shield. You intellectualize your feelings instead of actually feeling them. So when you are overwhelmed, when you are stressed, or when you are hurting, your brain automatically kicks into overdrive. You start thinking, well, if I just analyze this problem from every possible angle, if I just read enough psychology articles, or if I just sit in my room and think about it for 5 more hours, I can fix it myself. You convince yourself that asking for help is a sign of intellectual failure. I mean, why would you bother someone else with a problem when your brain is perfectly capable of solving complex equations, right? But emotional pain is not an equation. You cannot outthink a broken heart, and you cannot outlogic severe burnout. To really understand this, we have to look back at where this refusal to ask for help actually comes from. It almost always stems from a profound breach of trust in your formative years. For a lot of hyper-independent people, it traces back to childhood. Maybe you had parents who were physically present but emotionally entirely absent. So when you went to them crying because you had a bad day, you were met with annoyance, or you were told you were being too sensitive, or you were just completely ignored. Or, maybe you grew up in an environment where the adults around you were so chaotic or so overwhelmed with their own problems that you realized very quickly, look, there is no room for my needs here. You learned that if you had a problem, bringing it to the adults would only make the situation worse, so you adapted. You became the kid who needed nothing. You became the easy child. And that adaptation, honestly, is heartbreaking. Because what happens is, a child internalizes the idea that their needs are a burden. You start to associate vulnerability with danger. If I ask for help, I might be rejected. If I ask for help, I might be disappointed. If I ask for help, it will be used against me later. So, the safest option, the only viable option in your mind, is to build a fortress around yourself. You create this ironclad rule in your subconscious. I will only ever rely on myself because I am the only person who will never abandon me. It is a profound sort of self-protection, but the tragic irony is that the very armor you built to protect yourself from being hurt is now the exact thing that is suffocating you. This is where the deep thinker's tendency to overanalyze becomes incredibly destructive. When you are hyper-independent and you are drowning, you don't just refuse to ask for help. You actually construct a very elaborate, logical-sounding narrative to justify why you shouldn't ask for help. You think, well, my friends are dealing with their own stress right now, so it would be selfish of me to unload my baggage on them. Or, you think, if I tell my partner how badly I'm struggling, they will see me as weak, or they will lose respect for me. You practically write a thesis in your head about why staying silent is the most moral, considerate, and logical choice. You convince yourself that you are doing everyone else a favor by hiding your pain. But I mean, let's be honest for a second. Is it really about protecting them? Or is it actually about protecting yourself from the terrifying vulnerability of being seen? When you ask for help, you have to admit that you don't have it all together. You have to drop the facade of the strong, capable, totally in control person that you have spent years perfecting. For a deep thinker, the loss of that control is terrifying. You like to be the one who fixes things. You like to be the anchor. If you are not the strong one, then who are you? Your entire identity is wrapped up in your competence. And society really reinforces this toxic loop, doesn't it? People praise you for it all the time. They say things like, you are so strong, or I don't know how you handle so much, or you always have it together. And every time you hear that, it feels like a compliment, but it also acts as a lock on your cage. It validates your trauma response. It tells you that your worth is directly tied to your ability to endure suffering without complaining. So you become the strong friend. You become the person everyone else goes to for advice, for money, for emotional support. You are essentially holding up the sky for everyone around you, but you feel completely incapable of asking anyone to just hold an umbrella for you while it rains. The exhaustion of living like this is, frankly, indescribable. It is a deep, bone-weary fatigue that sleep cannot fix, because you are never actually resting. Even when you are sitting still, your mind is running 1,000 miles a minute, trying to micromanage your life, trying to anticipate every possible disaster so you can handle it yourself before it happens. This state of hypervigilance completely drains your nervous system. You start experiencing the physical manifestations of this suppressed need. You get chronic headaches, intense muscle tension in your shoulders and jaw, digestive issues, and a pervasive sense of burnout that makes even answering a simple text message feel like climbing a mountain. You are carrying a 100-pound backpack up a hill, and you are smiling and telling everyone the view is great, while your knees are literally buckling. There is also a profound loneliness that comes with hyper-independence. It is a very specific type of isolation. You can be surrounded by friends, you can be in a long-term romantic relationship, you can have a loving family, and yet feel completely and utterly alone in the world. Because nobody actually knows the real you. They only know the polished, impenetrable version of you that you allow them to see. They know the you that has all the answers, not the you that cries in the shower or stares at the ceiling at 3 a.m. terrified of the future. By refusing to ask for help, you are unintentionally denying the people who love you the opportunity to truly know you and support you. You are building an invisible wall that keeps you safe from disappointment, but also completely blocks out genuine connection. And part of the tragedy here is that the deep thinker is usually acutely aware of this dynamic. You are smart enough to know that your behavior is maladaptive. You have probably psychoanalyzed yourself a dozen times. You know you have avoidant tendencies, you know you have trust issues, you know you are overcompensating. But knowing the theory of why you are drowning doesn't actually pull you out of the water. Awareness does not equal healing. You can know all the psychological jargon in the world, but until you actually take the terrifying step of reaching your hand out and saying, I am not okay and I need you, you are going to stay stuck in that ocean. It is so vital to recognize that this refusal to seek support is rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. We are essentially a deeply social species. We are biologically hardwired for co-regulation. That means our nervous systems literally require the soothing presence of other human beings to calm down when we are distressed. You are not a machine. You were never meant to process all of your trauma, all of your stress, and all of your grief completely alone. Expecting yourself to do so is not strength. It is self-punishment. It is you repeating the emotional neglect you experienced in your past. But this time, you are the one doing the neglecting. When you refuse to let people help you, you are basically operating under the assumption that human relationships are purely transactional. You think, if I take from them, I owe them, or I am a burden. But healthy love, true connection, is not a spreadsheet where we tally up who did what for whom. People who genuinely care about you actually want to be there for you. Think about it. When someone you love comes to you in tears asking for help, do you view them as a burden? Do you think they are weak? No, of course not. You feel honored that they trust you. You feel empathy. You feel a desire to support them. Why is it so incredibly hard to believe that you are worthy of that exact same grace? Overcoming this ingrained hyper-independence requires entirely dismantling the belief system that keeps you isolated. It means looking at that traumatized inner part of yourself, the part that believes it is safer to be alone, and gently explaining that the war is actually over. The circumstances that forced you to become an impenetrable fortress no longer exist, or at least, you have the power to step outside of them now. It is about realizing that vulnerability is not a liability. In fact, for someone who has spent their entire life hiding behind a wall of competence, asking for help is quite literally the bravest thing you could ever possibly do. So how do we actually break this cycle? Because, let's be entirely honest here, you cannot just wake up one morning and decide to suddenly trust the entire universe. It just does not work like that. If you have spent your whole life building this impenetrable fortress of solitude around yourself, taking down those walls is going to feel incredibly unnatural and honestly terrifying. Your brain is going to scream at you that this is a terrible idea. When you first even think about reaching out to someone, your heart will probably race, your palms will get sweaty, and you will feel this overwhelming urge to just text them and say, "Never mind, I figured it out." But, we have to push past that initial panic. Right now, the very first step, and really the most crucial one, is to start challenging this massive, deeply rooted lie that you are a burden to other people. I want you to really think about this for a second. When your best friend or your partner comes to you and says, "Hey, I am struggling right now, can you help me?" Do you instantly think, "Wow, what an absolute burden this person is"? No, of course you don't. You probably feel, a deep sense of empathy. You probably feel honored that they trusted you enough to show you their vulnerable side. You actively want to be there for them. So, logically speaking, why do you fundamentally believe that you are the sole exception to this rule? Tell me why. This is where your analytical, deep-thinking brain can actually be used as an asset instead of a weapon. You have to start observing your own thoughts like a scientist studying a subject. When the urge to isolate kicks in, when you feel that familiar tightening in your chest and you think, "I have to handle this crisis entirely by myself," just pause, take a deep breath, and, actually interrogate that thought. Ask yourself, is this a fact, or is this a trauma response? Most of the time, honestly, it is the trauma talking. It is the ghost of a past situation where you were let down, and your nervous system is just trying to prevent that pain from happening again. You are very safe here right now. You do not have to start by dumping your deepest, darkest, most painful childhood traumas onto someone. That is way too big of a leap, and it will probably just trigger your avoidant tendencies anyway. Instead, you need to start incredibly small. Practice asking for help with things that literally do not matter. Ask someone to hold the door for you. Ask a friend to recommend a movie because you just cannot decide what to watch. Ask your partner to grab you a glass of water while they are up. I know it sounds ridiculously simple, almost silly, right? But what you are doing is essentially physical therapy for your trust muscles. You are giving your nervous system these tiny, low-stakes, micro-experiences of trust. It is helpful. And as you start doing this, you're going to notice something incredibly profound happening. Your relationships will actually start to deepen in ways you probably did not think were possible. Because, when you never ask for help, you are inadvertently creating this massive power imbalance in your friendships and your relationships. You are essentially positioning yourself as the savior, and you are making the other person the patient. That is not a real partnership, is it? True intimacy, the kind that actually fulfills us on a soul level, requires reciprocity. It requires the messy, uncomfortable, beautiful exchange of sometimes being the strong one and sometimes being the one who completely falls apart. You are simply giving them the wonderful gift of feeling needed right here and now. But, and this is a very big but, you have to be prepared for the fact that stepping out of hyper-independence might actually cost you some relationships. And honestly, that is a good thing. Over the years, because you have been so overly capable and so completely undemanding, you have likely attracted a lot of takers. You know the type, right? The energy vampires, the people who love having you around precisely because you never ask for anything, but you give absolutely everything. When you start setting boundaries, when you start saying, actually, I am overwhelmed and I need support right now, those people are going to push back. They might get angry, or they might just quietly disappear. Let them. Let them slowly walk far away very gracefully today. It is also incredibly important to redefine what strength actually means to you. For your whole life, you have equated strength with endurance. You thought being strong meant carrying 1,000 pounds of emotional weight on your back without ever breaking a sweat, or at least without ever letting anyone see you sweat. But real strength, actual resilient human strength, is knowing your limits. It is having the intense self-awareness to say, I have reached my capacity, and if I keep pushing, I'm going to break. It takes zero courage to hide behind a wall. It takes an immense, almost unfathomable amount of courage to stand in front of someone completely stripped of your armor and bravely ask them for a kind helping hand right away today. Ultimately, the goal here is not to flip all the way over to the other extreme. We are not trying to become completely codependent or helpless. The goal is to move from hyper-independence to healthy interdependence. Interdependence is this beautiful middle ground where you recognize that yes, you are a capable, autonomous, highly intelligent individual who can handle a lot of things on your own, but you also recognize that you are a human being, and human beings are literally wired for connection. It is the understanding that leaning on someone else does not diminish your power, it actually amplifies it. You can be the strong friend and still need a shoulder to cry on. Both of those exact things can be completely and wonderfully fully true indeed. So if you take absolutely nothing else away from this, I want you to really hear this last part. You have spent enough time in the deep water. You have proven that you can tread water for days, weeks, even years. You have earned your survival badge, right? But you don't have to just survive anymore. You are allowed to get on the boat. You are allowed to let someone wrap a warm towel around your shoulders and tell you that you are safe now. Please, I mean it, stop fighting the current all by yourself. The next time you feel the water rising, the next time your lungs start burning, and your over-analytical brain tells you to just swim harder, stop and pause, breathe deeply and calm down now. I want you to do the bravest thing you have ever done in your entire life. I want you to stop, look at the people who genuinely love you, and finally just ask for the rope. It is not going to be easy, and yes, it will probably feel like you are stepping off a cliff in the dark. But, the drop is not as far as you think it is. The people who care about you are waiting right there at the bottom to catch you. You do not have to be the invincible superhero every single day of your life. It is okay to be human, it is okay to be messy, and most importantly, it is okay to need help. Right here, right now, today. Have you ever been lying in bed, just staring up at the dark ceiling at 2 in the morning, totally exhausted but completely unable to sleep? Because your brain is furiously replaying a perfectly harmless, 5-minute conversation you had 3 days ago. You maybe said something slightly awkward to a coworker, or perhaps your tone was just a tiny bit off when you were talking to a barista. And now, your brain is treating this moment like an absolute life or death crisis. So, here you are, dissecting every single word, every tiny pause, every weird little facial expression, wondering what they thought of you. I mean, we all do this, right? It feels so incredibly common, yet so isolating at the exact same time. But really, why do we do it? Why do our minds just absolutely refuse to let go of these completely minor, incredibly insignificant social interactions? Well, today we are diving deep into the fascinating, and honestly sometimes exhausting, psychology of social rumination. We are going to explore exactly why your brain acts like a broken record, constantly looping these tiny, cringy moments, and eventually we'll talk about how you can actually train it to just stop. To really understand what is happening in your head, we first need to define what this actually is. Psychologists call this specific mental loop social rumination. Now, rumination in general is, it's basically just the process of continuously thinking about the same dark, frustrating, or anxiety-inducing thoughts over and over again. But social rumination is a very specific flavor of this. It is intensely focused on our interactions with other human beings. It's that post-event processing where you mentally rewind the tape of a social gathering or a quick chat, looking for essentially any evidence that you messed up, that you were judged, or that you somehow alienated yourself. You see, reflecting on a conversation is actually a good thing. It's, how we learn and grow. Reflection is saying, oh, maybe I shouldn't have interrupted them, I'll try to listen better next time. But rumination? Rumination is totally different. Rumination is not about problem solving at all. It's like being trapped in a mental washing machine, just spinning around in the dirty water of your own self-doubt. You aren't fixing anything, you are just obsessing over the stain. And the crazy part is, the situations we ruminate on are almost always incredibly minor. Like nobody is losing sleep because they gave a bad keynote speech to 10,000 people. I mean, okay, you would lose sleep over that. But that actually makes sense, right? That's a huge high-stakes event. But social rumination usually attacks us over the smallest, most mundane things. It's the joke you made in the elevator that didn't quite land, or the time you accidentally said "you too" when the movie theater employee told you to enjoy the film. Logically, you know that the other person forgot about it literally 2 seconds later. But emotionally, your brain is sounding the alarm bells. This massive disconnect between what actually happened and how deeply we feel, it is driven by a well-documented psychological phenomenon known as the spotlight effect. You know, the spotlight effect is this inherent cognitive bias we all have where we genuinely tend to believe that other people are paying way, way more attention to us than they actually are. We walk through life basically feeling like there is a giant, glowing spotlight aimed right at our foreheads, highlighting every single flaw, every stutter, every slightly weird hand gesture we make. I mean, think about it from your own perspective. You are the absolute center of your own universe. Every experience you have ever had is viewed through your own eyes. So naturally, your brain just assumes that everyone else is focused on you too. But the reality is, they aren't. They really aren't. Everyone else is walking around with their own imaginary spotlight, stressing out about the weird thing they said. But because we can't actually see inside their heads, we are left alone with our own exaggerated sense of being watched and judged, which perfectly fuels the endless cycle of overthinking. Now, if you want to know why our brains are wired to be this self-conscious, well, we have to take a little trip back in time and look at evolutionary psychology. I mean, it's easy to get frustrated with yourself and think, why am I so incredibly insecure? But the truth is, your brain is actually just trying to keep you alive. You see, tens of thousands of years ago, back when humans were living in early hunter-gatherer tribes, social acceptance wasn't just about feeling warm and fuzzy or getting invited to the cool caveman parties. Social acceptance was literal, physical survival. If you did something weird or offensive or annoying and you ended up getting kicked out of your tribe, well, you were probably going to die. You would either starve or freeze or get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. You could not survive on your own. So, through thousands of generations of evolution, the human brain developed a highly sensitive, incredibly reactive threat detection system entirely dedicated to monitoring our social standing. It is essentially an internal radar that is constantly scanning the environment, asking, am I safe? Does the group still like me? Did I do anything to jeopardize my belonging? When you replay that minor conversation in your head for days on end, you are actually experiencing an ancient evolutionary survival mechanism misfiring in the modern world. Your brain isn't just saying, oh, that was a slightly awkward chat. Your brain's primitive fear center is practically screaming, you have offended the tribe, you are going to be exiled to the wilderness and die. The emotional reaction is so wildly out of proportion to the actual event, because our neurobiology hasn't quite caught up to the fact that an awkward silence in a Zoom meeting is not going to result in us being eaten by wolves. And if we look even closer at the actual neurology of what's happening inside your skull during these late-night overthinking sessions, it becomes even more fascinating. There is a specific network in your brain called the default mode network, or the DMN. Now, the DMN is essentially the network that lights up when your brain is, well, basically at rest. When you aren't actively focusing on a task, like doing a math problem or navigating traffic, your DMN takes over. It's responsible for daydreaming, thinking about the past, worrying about the future, and most importantly, thinking about yourself and your relationships with others. For some people, particularly those who are prone to anxiety or social rumination, this default mode network is basically stuck in overdrive. It's like a car engine that just keeps revving even when it's parked in the driveway. When your DMN is hyperactive, it endlessly pulls up past memories and feeds them straight into your amygdala. Now, the amygdala, as you might already know, is the emotional processing center of the brain. It's the part that regulates fear and panic. So, your DMN serves up this memory of you waving at someone who wasn't actually waving at you, and your amygdala reacts exactly as if a physical threat is standing right in front of you. It dumps cortisol and adrenaline into your bloodstream. Your heart rate might literally increase as you lie in bed thinking about it. Your face might flush with embarrassment all over again days later. Your body is physically experiencing the stress of the social mistake as if it is happening right now in real time. This biological feedback loop makes it incredibly difficult to just let it go, because your body is telling you that the danger is still actively present. Furthermore, we also have to consider how modern society and personality traits play into this. I mean, not everyone ruminates to the exact same degree. People who struggle with perfectionism or have a strong desire for control tend to be hit the hardest by social rumination. Because, let's be honest, social interactions are inherently messy and completely unpredictable. You can't write a script for a conversation. You can't control how the other person is going to react, or what mood they are in, or how they will interpret your words. For a perfectionist, this lack of control is deeply uncomfortable. So after the conversation ends, the perfectionist's brain tries to regain a sense of control by analyzing the interaction to death. It's an illusion, of course. Thinking about it 100 times doesn't change what happened, but it gives the brain a false sense of doing something productive. It feels like, if I can just figure out exactly where I went wrong, I will never make this mistake ever again. But, we always make mistakes again because we are human beings, not programmed robots. And then there is the impact of how we communicate today. I mean, think about text messaging, emails, and social media. These platforms have basically created an entirely new breeding ground for social rumination. In the past, a conversation happened, the words disappeared into the air, and you only had your fuzzy memory of it to obsess over. But now we have receipts. Now you can literally pull up a text thread and reread a message 30 times. You can analyze the punctuation. Why did they use a period at the end of that sentence? Are they mad? Why did it take them 4 hours to reply to a joke? Was it not funny? Did it offend them? We have essentially handed our ruminating brains a permanent, perfectly preserved archive of every tiny social micro-interaction we have all day long. It is frankly completely overwhelming for our nervous systems. So, when you take all of this together, the evolutionary survival drive to stay in the tribe, the hyperactive default mode network looping our memories, the harsh physiological reactions of the amygdala, the cognitive distortion of the spotlight effect, and the modern digital landscape that records all our awkwardness. It honestly starts to make total sense why we get so stuck in our own heads. It isn't because you are broken or overly sensitive or crazy. It is because you have a highly evolved, deeply complex human brain that is just trying a little too hard to keep you socially safe. But even though we now understand exactly why this happens, it doesn't change the fact that living this way is exhausting. It drains your energy, it steals your focus, and it robs you of the peace of mind you deserve. Recognizing the trap of social rumination is an essential first step, but the real question we have to ask ourselves now is, how do we break the loop? How do we tell our primitive, overly protective brains to just stand down and finally give it a rest? So, we've established that your brain is basically just this overprotective bodyguard that is, trying a little bit too hard to keep you from getting kicked out of the tribe. It is honestly comforting to know that you aren't just going crazy, right? But understanding the science is really only half the battle here. Knowing your amygdala is throwing an unnecessary panic attack at 2 in the morning doesn't magically make the feeling of intense embarrassment just disappear. I mean, if it were that easy, we would all just logically think our way out of anxiety. So, how do we actually stop this? How do we take the steering wheel back from a brain that is absolutely determined to drive us off the cliff of overthinking? Well, breaking the cycle of social rumination requires a mix of psychological tricks and, honestly, just a lot of practice in changing how you actively relate to your own thoughts. The very first tool you can use is something psychologists call cognitive diffusion. I know it sounds super clinical, but it basically just means creating distance between you and your thoughts. You see, when we ruminate, we tend to fully fuse with our thoughts. If you think, I sounded like an idiot, your brain accepts that as a cold, hard fact. Like, it thinks it is the absolute truth. But cognitive diffusion teaches you to step back and say, I am having the thought that I sounded like an idiot. Do you see the difference? I mean, it seems like a really tiny shift, but neurologically, it is massive. It reminds your brain that thoughts are just thoughts. They are basically just little electrical impulses firing off. They aren't objective reality. So the next time you are agonizing over a weird goodbye, try labeling it. Acknowledging the habit takes the emotional power away. Another incredibly powerful strategy is to radically shift your perspective using something called the 10-10-10 rule. You know, when you are deeply caught up in replaying a conversation, your brain essentially gives you tunnel vision. It makes this tiny 5-minute interaction feel like the most important event of your entire life. So to break that tunnel vision, you have to actively force your brain to zoom out. Ask yourself, will this awkward moment matter in 10 days? Well, maybe, but probably not. Will it matter in 10 months? Definitely not. Will it matter in 10 years? Like, absolutely, unequivocally no. Think back to 10 years ago. Can you even remember a single awkward conversation you had? Of course you can't. Your brain has completely deleted those files because they just didn't matter. Reminding yourself of this vast timeline helps basically pop the bubble of anxiety. It puts things right back into their proper, very insignificant context. But what if you are trying to use logic and your brain is just screaming over you? Like, what if the anxiety is just so physical that you can't even think straight? Well, that is when you have to use pattern interruption. You see, rumination is essentially a deeply ingrained neurological groove, like a track on a record player. To stop the song from playing, you literally have to bump the needle. When you catch yourself looping on a thought, you need to abruptly change your physical state or your environment. I mean, don't just lie there in the dark and let it happen. Get up. Seriously, physically get out of bed. Go drink a glass of freezing cold water or do some jumping jacks. You know, some people even hold an ice cube in their hand. The intense physical sensation acts like a hard reset for your nervous system, forcing your brain to pull its attention into the present moment. We also really need to address the way we talk to ourselves during these episodes. I mean, think about the internal monologue you have when you are ruminating. It is usually brutal, isn't it? You would literally never speak to a friend the way you speak to yourself when you make a social mistake. If your best friend came to you and said, "Oh my gosh, I accidentally called my boss mom today. My life is totally over," you wouldn't say, "Yeah, you're a complete failure." Like, of course not. You would laugh. You would tell them it is fine. And you would remind them that everyone makes mistakes. So why on earth do we withhold that basic kindness from ourselves? Practicing self-compassion isn't just fluffy nonsense. It is scientifically proven to calm the amygdala. Next time you are beating yourself up, try literally talking to yourself as if you were speaking to someone you deeply love. It softens the blow entirely. Another really helpful trick is to actively challenge your inner spotlight. As we talked about earlier, you know, we all suffer from the spotlight effect, believing everyone is staring at us. So deliberately turn the spotlight completely around. Think about the person you had the awkward conversation with. Can you remember exactly what they were wearing? Can you remember the precise words they used? Can you recall if they stuttered or paused or made a weird face? I mean, chances are you really can't because you were too focused on yourself. And here is the deeply comforting truth. They are doing the exact same thing. They aren't lying in bed judging your weird comment. They're lying in bed judging their own. Realizing that everyone is essentially trapped in their own little bubble of self-consciousness is just tremendously freeing. It gives you permission to just let yourself off the hook because nobody is actually paying that much attention to you anyway. Finally, and this might be the hardest step of all, you just have to learn to embrace the cringe. I mean, being an awkward, occasionally messy human being is just the cost of admission to life. You cannot exist in society without occasionally putting your foot in your mouth, sending a text to the wrong person, or waving at someone who is waving at the person behind you. It is going to happen. The suffering doesn't actually come from the mistake itself. The suffering comes from our desperate, exhausting resistance to it. We want to be perfectly smooth, and when we aren't, we punish ourselves. But what if you just accepted it? What if, the next time you do something socially awkward, you take a deep breath, smile, and say, "Well, that was totally embarrassing," and then move on? Giving yourself the permission to be imperfect, to be a little bit cringy sometimes, takes the pressure completely off your shoulders. Ultimately, overcoming social rumination isn't about perfectly engineering your life so that you never make a social mistake ever again. That is a completely impossible standard, and trying to reach it will only make you infinitely more anxious. It is really just about changing how you recover from those mistakes. It is about recognizing the primal fear for what it is, stepping back from the spinning thoughts, and reminding your nervous system that you are totally safe. You aren't going to be kicked out of the tribe. You are just a normal person, living a normal life, trying to figure it all out just like literally everybody else. So, the next time you find yourself staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m, replaying a conversation from Tuesday, remember, your brain is trying to protect you. Take a deep breath, forgive yourself for being human, and just let it go. Please just try to get some sleep. You really truly deserve to finally experience some peace of mind, close your heavy eyes, and just get a wonderfully deep, incredibly restful night of uninterrupted sleep tonight.